The telegram arrived at 7:30 in the morning, and it changed everything before the day had even properly begun. Edward Ashworth, the 9th Duke of Harrowfield, was already dressed when his butler, a quiet and efficient man named Philip, brought it to him on a silver tray. Edward had been standing at the window of his London estate, watching the grey October sky press down on the rooftops of Mayfair like a heavy lid. He had not slept well. He had not slept well in 3 days, not since the situation with the Vienna summit had begun to unravel. He took the telegram without looking at Philip. He unfolded it. He read it once. Then he read it again, slower this time, as though the words might rearrange themselves into something better. They did not. The message was from Dr. Clement White, the personal physician of Franklin Gray, the Foreign Office's chief interpreter, and the man who was supposed to accompany Edward to Vienna in 4 days' time. The message was brief and without apology. Franklin Gray had been struck down by typhoid fever. He was in hospital and would not be leaving it for several weeks at the very least. He could not travel. He could not work. He was, for all practical purposes of this particular week, entirely unavailable. Edward set the telegram down on his writing desk. He did not shout. He was not the kind of man who shouted when things went wrong. He had been taught from an early age that a man of his position did not lose his composure in the face of difficulty. His father had told him that, and his grandfather before that. The Ashworth men were known for their steadiness. They were not known for panic. But what Edward felt in that moment, standing alone in his study, with the telegram on the desk in front of him, and the grey London morning pressing against the glass, was something very close to panic. The Vienna summit was not a social occasion. It was not the kind of meeting that could be rescheduled with a polite note and a fresh invitation. It had taken 14 months of careful negotiation, simply to bring all the relevant parties to the same table. The Austrian imperial government, the Russian commerce delegation, the Prussian trade ministry, the Hungarian railway authority, the French investment council, the Ottoman commercial envoy, and the Italian shipping consortium. All of these had agreed, after enormous difficulty and considerable diplomatic effort, to meet in Vienna for 5 days beginning on the 14th of October. The purpose of these meetings was to settle the question of coal transport and railway concessions across Central and Eastern Europe, a question that had significant financial consequences for British industrial interests, and therefore for the government that had sent Edward there to represent them. Edward's role was not simply ceremonial. He was the primary British negotiator. The Foreign Secretary had chosen him specifically because of his previous work in similar negotiations and because of his ability to move between social and official settings with equal skill. But none of that skill, none of that experience, none of the years he had spent preparing for exactly this kind of moment would mean anything without the ability to communicate. The summit was to be conducted without a shared official language. The parties had agreed to this at the preliminary stage, each government insisting that their delegates be permitted to speak in their own tongue. It had seemed, at the time, like a reasonable compromise. It had not seemed, at the time, like the potential catastrophe it now represented. Franklin Gray had spoken 7 languages. He had been with the Foreign Office for 22 years. He had interpreted at 4 previous international summits. He had been the reason this particular arrangement had been agreed to at all, because everyone knew that Franklin Gray would be there, and Franklin Gray could handle anything. Franklin Gray was now lying in a hospital bed with a fever of 103 degrees, and he would not be going to Vienna. Edward called for Gideon Cross, his personal secretary, at 8 o'clock. Gideon arrived within minutes, notebook in hand, an expression already carefully neutral, which told Edward that Gideon had already heard about the telegram. In a house as well run as Edward's, information moved quickly. "You've heard," Edward said. "I have, Your Grace." "Then you know what we need. We need an interpreter." "Not just an interpreter," Edward said. He moved away from the desk and stood with his back to the room, looking out at the street below. A milk cart was making its way slowly along the cobblestones. A woman in a dark coat was walking quickly with her head down. Everything outside looked completely ordinary, which seemed almost offensive given the scale of what had just gone wrong. "We need someone with the same range as Gray. German, French, Russian, Italian, at the very minimum. Hungarian would be ideal. Ottoman Turkish if such a person exists. And we need them in 4 days." Gideon was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I'll contact the agency on Pall Mall first. They handled the Lisbon delegation last year. Do that. Also the Diplomatic Language Bureau on Whitehall. And get a message to the Foreign Office, not to the Secretary himself yet, but to Henderson in the Resources Department. Tell him what's happened and ask what they can provide." "Yes, Your Grace." "And Gideon," Edward turned. "Be clear about the timetable. 4 days. We leave on the 10th. Make sure everyone understands there is no flexibility in that date." Gideon nodded and left without further comment. Edward turned back to the window. The milk cart had moved on. The woman in the dark coat had disappeared around a corner. The street was empty and quiet and utterly unhelpful. He spent the morning in meetings that had been arranged weeks earlier and that could not be cancelled without causing their own complications. He met with his solicitor about a property matter in the north. He met with the manager of his Derbyshire coal interests. He signed 12 letters and reviewed a land survey. He did all of this with the careful attention it deserved, because one of the things Edward had learned over 38 years of life and 22 years of managing the Harrowfield estate was that the ordinary business of the world did not pause for crises. You managed the crisis and you managed everything else at the same time, and you did not confuse the two, and you did not let either suffer because of the other. But in between appointments, in the brief silences while his solicitor shuffled papers or his secretary found a document, Edward's mind returned to Vienna. He thought about the Russian envoy, a man named Volkov who was known for his patience and his long memory. He thought about the Austrian chairman, Baron Hoffmann, who had a talent for inserting small, technically legal clauses into agreements that changed their meaning entirely. He thought about the Hungarian Railway Authority's chief negotiator, a man he had never met, but who had a reputation for conducting entire conversations in apparent pleasantries that were in fact detailed position statements. Without someone who could hear all of this, process it, translate it not just word for word but nuance by nuance, Edward would be walking into that room half blind. By 2 in the afternoon, Gideon had reported back from the first 2 agencies. The Pall Mall firm had 2 available interpreters. One spoke French and German only. The other spoke German, Italian, and some Russian, but admitted in his response letter that his Russian was conversational rather than professional. Neither could manage Hungarian. Neither had any Ottoman Turkish at all. The Diplomatic Language Bureau had one candidate with broader range, but he was currently in Brussels on a Foreign Office assignment and could not be recalled in time. Henderson at the Foreign Office sent a message that arrived at 2:30. It was regretful in tone and thin in content. All of their senior interpreters were currently deployed. They had one individual who might be able to assist, but he spoke only 4 of the required languages and had never worked at summit level. Henderson offered his personal regrets and suggested that perhaps the summit's Austrian hosts could provide interpretation support. Edward read this message and felt something harden in his chest. He could not ask the Austrians to provide interpreters for a British delegation. The implications of that, the appearance of dependence, the absence of any guarantee that translation would be neutral, were simply not acceptable. Whatever else happened, he could not do that. He called Gideon back in at 3 o'clock. What else is there? Beyond the agencies and the Foreign Office, think further. Gideon sat down, which was unusual. He was not normally a man who sat when Edward was standing. It suggested he was thinking carefully and wanted to do it properly. There are private individuals, he said slowly. People who are not registered with agencies but who have the skills. Scholars, sometimes. People who have lived abroad. Former diplomatic families. Do you have names? Not yet. But I can find them. Then find them. Tonight if possible. Gideon nodded. He started to rise, then stopped. He had the look of a man about to say something he was not entirely sure he should say. Edward had known Gideon Cross for 9 years and had learned to pay attention to that look. There is one name, Gideon said. I heard it some time ago, in passing, from someone at the Foreign Office. I did not think much of it at the time because the circumstances seemed unlikely. But given where we are now, I think it should be mentioned. Go on. A woman. Her name is Eleanor Voss. Her father was Frederick Voss, who served as a junior attaché in the diplomatic service before certain difficulties ended his career. The daughter was educated across Europe during his years of service. Geneva, Budapest, St. Petersburg, and I believe sometime in Constantinople as well. By all accounts, she speaks several languages with genuine fluency, not just tourist-level competence. The person who mentioned her said she had applied to the Foreign Office's Translation Bureau and been turned away. Edward said nothing for a moment. Then, why was she turned away? I don't know, Your Grace. I assume because she is a woman. Edward walked back to his desk and sat down. He pressed his fingers together and looked at the surface of the desk rather than at Gideon. The desk was mahogany, old and polished to a deep shine, and it had belonged to his father before him. He had made a great many decisions at this desk. He tried to think clearly now. A woman at the negotiating table, he said, in Vienna, at an imperial summit, seated behind it perhaps. In a support role, the specific configuration could be discussed. The Austrian delegation will raise objections. They might. The Russian envoy certainly will. That is also possible. Edward was quiet. He drummed his fingers once on the desk, slowly, and stopped. How many languages? The source said 7. I cannot verify that independently. 7. Franklin Gray had spoken 7. This woman apparently spoke 7. Edward thought about the mathematics of the situation. He thought about what was at stake: the coal concessions, the railway routes, the commercial relationships that would shape British industrial capacity for the next 20 years. He thought about arriving in Vienna without a capable interpreter, and trying to manage that room with a man who spoke only 4 of the relevant languages and had never been to a summit. He thought about his father's voice, telling him that a man in his position did not allow his own discomfort to become more important than his duty. "Send a letter," he said, "tonight, polite but direct. Explain the situation, and ask if she would be available to meet tomorrow morning. Do not mention the summit specifically in writing. Just say that an urgent matter of translation is required, and that we would value her consideration." Gideon made a note. What if she declines? Then we continue looking. Edward picked up his pen. But find out everything you can about her before the morning. I want to know what I'm dealing with. What Gideon found, in the hours that followed, painted a picture that was both more interesting and more complicated than Edward had expected. Eleanor Voss was 34 years old. She was the only child of Frederick Voss, who had served the diplomatic service from 1861 to 1879, when a financial scandal involving funds that had gone missing from the Bucharest consulate had ended his career and most of his reputation simultaneously. Frederick Voss had always maintained that he had not stolen the money, that the accounts had been mismanaged by others, and that he had been made convenient. Whether or not this was true, the result was the same. He was dismissed, stripped of his pension, and returned to London with his wife, his daughter, and enough social disgrace to make his name a liability for years to come. He had died in 1884, 3 years after the family's return, leaving behind his wife, his daughter, his debts, and a small house in Bloomsbury that had somehow escaped the creditors. Eleanor Voss had spent the years since then giving language lessons to the children of wealthy families and doing occasional translation work for publishers who needed foreign texts rendered into English. She spoke French, German, Russian, Italian, and Hungarian, with what sources described as genuine professional fluency. She also spoke Ottoman Turkish, having spent a year in Constantinople with her father during his posting there, and she read Greek and Latin at an academic level. By every account that Gideon was able to gather, she was extraordinarily capable. She had applied to the Foreign Office's Translation Bureau in 1882 and again in 1885. Both applications had been declined without explanation. She lived quietly. She did not attend social events. She was known in the small world of Bloomsbury academics and foreign families who occasionally used her services as thorough, reliable, and somewhat difficult to make conversation with on topics that were not directly relevant to the work at hand. Edward read Gideon's notes late that evening. He sat alone in his study with a cup of tea that had gone cold and the notes spread across the desk in front of him. Outside, London was settling into its nighttime sounds. The distant clatter of a late carriage, the call of a street vendor somewhere far off. Frederick Voss's daughter, a woman who had been educated across the courts of Europe, who had grown up listening to diplomats in 4 countries, who had absorbed languages the way other children absorbed nursery rhymes, and who had been turned away twice by the very institution that most needed people like her. Edward thought about the summit. He thought about the Russian envoy and the Austrian baron and the Hungarian railway man and all the other sharp, careful minds who would be in that room. He thought about what it would cost, what it would truly cost, not in reputation but in outcome, in policy, in the practical future of British commercial interests, to walk into that room without the right interpreter. He thought about the woman in Bloomsbury who gave language lessons to children and translated books for publishers because the Foreign Office had decided, without explanation, that her skills were not required. He picked up his pen. He did not usually write his own letters. That was Gideon's function, but this one, he felt, he should write himself. It needed a particular tone that he did not want to try to explain to someone else. It needed to be honest about the situation, without being pathetic about it. It needed to convey urgency without desperation. It needed to make clear that this was a professional request, and that she would be treated as a professional. He wrote 3 drafts before he was satisfied. The final version was brief and direct. It explained that he was Edward Ashworth, that he was leading a British delegation to an international summit in 4 days' time, that his scheduled interpreter had been taken ill, and that her name had come to his attention as someone with exceptional language skills that might be exactly what the situation required. He asked if she would be willing to meet at her convenience the following morning to discuss the matter further. He included his address and said that a carriage could be sent for her if she preferred. He did not mention Vienna specifically. He did not mention the scale of what was at stake. He did not want to overwhelm the letter with information she had not yet agreed to receive. He sealed it, called for Philip, and had it sent by hand that same evening. Then he went to bed and lay awake for most of the night, which was becoming something of a habit. The morning came gray and cold, as October mornings in London tended to do. Edward was at his desk by 7:30, working through correspondence that had accumulated the previous day. Gideon arrived at 8 with coffee and the morning papers and the quiet, careful efficiency that made him invaluable. At 9, a reply arrived. It was handwritten, brief, and in handwriting that was clean and deliberate without being ornate. It said simply, "I will call at 10 o'clock. Eleanor Voss." No, Your Grace. No elaborate salutation. No expression of pleasure or honor at being considered. Just a name and a time and a full stop. Edward looked at the note for a long moment. He had a feeling, not quite definable, that the next few days were not going to go the way he was used to things going. He was not wrong. At 10 o'clock precisely, Eleanor Voss arrived. She came without a companion, which was already unusual. Most women of her social position, even reduced ones, brought a maid or a female relation on visits to unfamiliar households, particularly to the household of a man they had never met. Eleanor Voss came alone. She handed her coat and gloves to Philip with the manner of someone who did this sort of thing regularly, glanced briefly around the entrance hall in a way that suggested she was taking in information without making a show of doing so, and followed the footman to Edward's study with a step that was unhurried. Edward stood when she entered. She was of medium height, with dark hair pinned back very simply, and gray eyes that were watching him as carefully as he was watching her. She wore a dark blue dress that was neat and well-maintained but not fashionable. She carried a leather document case under her arm, which he had not expected. "Miss Voss," he said, "thank you for coming." "Of course," she said, "you have a problem and you need it solved. That is the usual arrangement." There was nothing impolite in the words, but they were not what Edward had expected to hear in his own study, from someone who had arrived to be considered for a position. He gestured to the chair across from his desk and she sat down, setting the document case on her lap. He sat. He considered how to begin and then simply began. "I expect you would like to know the full situation before anything else." "That would be sensible," she agreed. And so he told her. He told her about the Vienna summit, about Franklin Gray, about the telegram and the agency searches, and the Foreign Office's inability to help. He told her about the parties involved, and the languages in use, and the general shape of what the 5 days of meetings would require. He was thorough because she looked like the kind of person who would notice if he left something out, and because the last thing he needed right now was to discover, halfway through the summit, that she had agreed to something she had not been properly informed about. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she opened the document case and took out a small sheaf of papers. "I took the liberty," she said, "of reviewing the publicly available records of the preliminary negotiations, the exchange of position statements from last March, the communiques from the July preparatory session, and the Austrian government's published agenda for the summit proceedings." She set the papers on the desk in front of him. They were covered in small, dense annotations in 4 different colors of ink. "I noticed a discrepancy between the Austrian position statement issued in March and the version of the same statement that was summarized in the British diplomatic briefing. The original uses the phrase conditionally exclusive in relation to the railway tariff clause. The British summary rendered this as preferentially exclusive, which has a different legal implication under Austro-Hungarian commercial law. Edward looked at the papers. He looked at the annotations. He looked at the careful distinctions written in small, precise handwriting in the margins. Then he looked at her. "When did you prepare this?" he asked. "Last night, after your letter arrived." He had sent the letter at 10 o'clock in the evening. She had received it, read it, obtained the relevant documents, reviewed them, annotated them, and arrived at his house 12 hours later with a substantive finding about a material error in the British Foreign Office's own briefing materials. He had a great deal more to say, and so did she, and they said it over the next 2 hours in a conversation that was unlike any meeting Edward had conducted in recent memory. But the decision, if he was honest, had effectively been made in that first moment. Not because he was charmed, or because he was desperate, or because he had no other choice. Because she had come in with a document case and a finding that no one else had caught, and she had given it to him without any drama, as though it were simply the obvious thing to do. It was the obvious thing to do. He just had not expected her to do it. He had not, he realized, expected much of anything from Eleanor Voss, and he was already beginning to understand that this was going to be one of the more significant errors of his recent thinking. Eleanor had not told her mother about the letter. This was not because she feared her mother's reaction. Catherine Voss was a practical woman who had survived a public disgrace, the loss of her home, the loss of her social standing, the loss of her husband, and 15 years of reduced circumstances with a kind of calm, dry resilience that Eleanor deeply admired. Catherine would not have fainted or wept at the news that her daughter had received an urgent letter from a duke. She would have asked 3 or 4 precise questions and then made tea. Eleanor had not told her because she had wanted to think about it alone first. The thinking had taken approximately 30 seconds. She had read the letter once, set it down on the kitchen table, looked out at the small garden behind the Bloomsbury house where the last of the autumn roses were losing their petals in a cold wind, and made her decision. Then she had spent the next 11 hours working. This was not unusual behavior for Eleanor. When she encountered a problem, she worked. When she was uncertain about something, she worked. When she was anxious or tired or frustrated or any of the other things she occasionally felt but did not consider useful to linger on, she worked. It had been this way since she was a child, since the years of moving from city to city, as her father's postings changed, and the only constant was the desk in whatever temporary room was hers, and the books she carried with her, and the work of understanding the language of wherever she happened to be. She had liked those years, actually. She knew she was not supposed to say that, because the conventional understanding of a childhood spent moving between foreign cities in the service of a diplomat's career was that it must have been disruptive and difficult. And it had been disruptive, sometimes, and difficult, sometimes, but it had also been extraordinary. She had been 11 years old in Geneva and learned to argue with a French shopkeeper about the correct price of bread, and won. She had been 14 in Budapest and sat in a garden with the daughters of a Hungarian civil servant and learned the structure of a language that most English children would never hear in their lifetimes. She had been 17 in St. Petersburg and attended a dinner where the guests had included a minor member of the Russian imperial court and a German composer and a French poet and an Ottoman merchant, all of whom had found each other perfectly incomprehensible, and Eleanor had spent 2 hours quietly and efficiently connecting all of them to each other like a human telegraph wire, moving between tables, translating conversations, making connections that could not otherwise have been made. She had been good at it. She had always been good at it. She had understood, from a young age, that language was not simply a tool for communication. It was a window into how people thought. Every language had different shapes for different ideas. A thing that existed as a single precise word in Russian might require an entire sentence to express in English. A concept that French treated as abstract and philosophical, Hungarian might render as immediate and physical. When you understood the differences between languages, you understood something about the differences between the people who spoke them, and that understanding was useful in ways that went far beyond simple conversation. This was why the Foreign Office rejections had hurt in the way they had. Not the hurt of wounded pride exactly. Eleanor did not think of herself as a person who suffered greatly from wounded pride. She had learned to be practical about what the world was and what it was willing to offer, and she had stopped expecting it to offer things it was not inclined to give. But the rejection had hurt in a different, quieter way, because the Foreign Office Translation Bureau was the one institution in England that was specifically designed to value and employ exactly the skills she had, and they had looked at those skills and at her, and decided, apparently without any particular difficulty, that the two things could not be combined in a useful way. She knew why. She had known why before the rejections came. Women did not work for the Foreign Office in professional capacities. Women might type letters or file correspondence, but they did not sit at tables where policy was made or interpreted. The fact that she could do the work better than most of the men who did sit at those tables was not, within the current understanding of the world, a relevant consideration. Eleanor had found this infuriating for approximately 2 years after the second rejection. Then she had decided, on a gray February morning not unlike this October one, that infuriation was not productive, and that she would simply do what she could within the constraints of what the world was currently permitting, and wait for the world to catch up. She gave language lessons to the children of wealthy families. She was good at this too. Children learned differently from adults. They were less self-conscious, less worried about making errors, more willing to simply absorb and imitate, which was in many ways the most efficient way to learn a language. She had students who were now reasonably competent in German or French or Italian, because she had taught them not to be afraid of it, not to think of it as a code to be cracked but as a door to be walked through. She also translated texts for publishers, primarily academic works and some fiction, German to English mostly, occasional French. The pay was modest and the work was not always interesting, but it was consistent and it used her skills, and she had long since made peace with the difference between what she could theoretically do and what she was actually permitted to do. And then the Duke's letter had arrived, and the 30 seconds of thinking had produced a clear answer, and she had spent 11 hours working. She had obtained the publicly available documents from two sources, a colleague at the British Museum who had access to recent diplomatic publications, and a former contact at the Austrian consulate in London, a junior secretary named Horst, who had been a student of hers some years earlier, and who, out of some combination of gratitude and residual affection for his old teacher, had sent her a copy of the Austrian government's official summit agenda without being asked why she wanted it. She had reviewed everything. She had read the preparatory session communiques and the position statements, and the British government's own internal briefing summary, which Horst had not provided, but which she had obtained through a different channel she preferred not to think about too carefully. She had read it all in the original languages, and she had compared the versions against each other, and she had found the discrepancy about the tariff clause because she was the kind of person who found discrepancies, the kind of person whose mind naturally moved toward the place where two things that should agree did not quite agree. The difference between conditionally exclusive and preferentially exclusive was not large in ordinary terms. In the context of Austro-Hungarian commercial law, as she had explained to the Duke, it was significant. Conditionally exclusive meant that the exclusivity of the railway tariff arrangement depended on specific ongoing conditions being met. Preferentially exclusive meant something closer to a general preference that could be set aside in exceptional circumstances. The Austrian legal tradition interpreted these differently, with different default assumptions about the parties' obligations if the conditions changed. The British negotiating position, built on the mistranslated summary, was therefore resting on a slightly different understanding of its own strength than the Austrian position was. Eleanor had expected the Duke to be annoyed about this. She had not expected him to be as quick about it as he was. He had understood the implication of the discrepancy almost immediately, which meant he had a functional grasp of legal language and how it worked in practice, which was more than she had necessarily assumed coming in. She had also noted, in the way she noted most things, that he had written her letter himself. The handwriting was different from the previous diplomatic correspondence she had seen attributed to his office. Gideon Cross's handwriting was smaller and more compressed, and the letter had a directness to it that suggested it had not passed through anyone else's editing. He had written it himself late at night and had it sent by hand because he had needed to control the message and had not wanted to delegate it. She understood that impulse. She felt it herself regularly. The meeting lasted 2 hours and 20 minutes. They covered the full scope of what the summit would require. She asked about the specific delegations, their known positions, the personalities of the chief negotiators. He answered with more detail than she had expected, which told her he was well prepared, and also that he had decided to trust her with the full picture, rather than a managed version of it. She appreciated this without saying so. The managed version would have been less useful. She asked about the physical arrangements, where she would sit, how the interpretation would be structured, whether there would be any preliminary meetings before the formal sessions began. He told her about the Austrian hotel where the British delegation would be staying and the conference room's expected layout. She asked whether the Austrian hosts would have their own interpreters present. He said probably yes, for their own convenience, but that they would not be working for the British delegation. She nodded. That was the arrangement she had expected. She told him her terms. She did this without preamble, because there was no point being indirect about something this important. She would require a seat at the main table, not a secondary position. She would require access to all relevant briefing materials in full, not summarized versions. She would require the ability to speak directly to the Duke during sessions when she needed to convey something urgent, without routing the communication through anyone else. And she would require the same professional discretion extended to any other member of the delegation. Nothing she heard, in any language, would be shared outside the delegation's confidence. She watched his face during this. She had learned to watch faces carefully in negotiating rooms. His expression moved through something she identified as mild surprise at the first condition, a moment of calculation at the second, and then a settling into something that was not quite agreement but was the beginning of it. The seat at the main table may cause problems, he said. Yes, she agreed, it will, but I cannot do the work from behind it. The nuances of what I need to hear and respond to in real time require that I am in the conversation, not adjacent to it. If you want someone to sit behind a screen and pass notes, you should find a different person. There was a pause, not an uncomfortable one, more like the pause of someone deciding whether to take a particular road that they can see as slightly unconventional but also, on consideration, probably the right one. The seat at the main table, he said. Yes, that can be arranged. She had thought it would be more difficult than that. She did not say so. They agreed on her fee. She named a number and he agreed to it without negotiation, which told her either that it was very reasonable or that he was in no position to argue. She suspected both were true. They agreed on the departure date, the arrangements for travel, and the hotel. She would travel as a member of the delegation, not as a separate private party, which meant she would be under the delegation's logistical umbrella. As she was leaving, she paused at the door of his study. She had not intended to say anything further, but something made her turn. "Your Grace." He looked up from the notes he had already begun making. "The Austrian chairman is Baron Hoffmann. He has a particular habit, in preliminary conversations, of asking very simple questions in German that are actually requests for commitments, disguised as pleasantries. If you answer them as pleasantries, you will have committed to things you did not intend to commit to. I will intercept those, but I need you to not look surprised when I do." He looked at her for a moment. "How do you know about Baron Hoffmann's habits?" "I attended a luncheon in Vienna in 1883 with my father. Baron Hoffmann was there. I watched him do it to 3 different people in one afternoon." Another pause. "All right," he said. "I won't look surprised." She left. She walked back to Bloomsbury because the morning was cold but dry and she needed to think, and thinking went better for her when she was moving. The streets were busy with late morning traffic, carriages, delivery carts, people on foot going about their ordinary business. She moved through it all without difficulty, her mind turning over the details of the conversation, cataloging what she now knew against what she would need to know by the time they arrived in Vienna. Her mother was in the parlor when she got home, reading a letter from a cousin in Dorset. Catherine looked up when Eleanor came in. She took in Eleanor's expression, which Eleanor knew was very controlled, and the slight energy in the way Eleanor took off her coat, and came to her own conclusions. "Something has happened," Catherine said. "Yes." Eleanor sat down. "I've been engaged to interpret at an international diplomatic summit in Vienna. We leave in 4 days." Catherine set down the cousin's letter. She looked at Eleanor for a moment, then she said, "How many languages?" 7 in use. I can manage all of them." "And who is the party?" "Edward Ashworth, the Duke of Harrowfield." Catherine was quiet for a moment. Then she said something that surprised Eleanor. "Your father would have been pleased." Eleanor looked at her mother. Catherine's face was composed, as it usually was, but there was something in it that was real, and that Eleanor did not often see there. Something like a very old, very quiet satisfaction. "He believed, always," Catherine continued, "that you were the better diplomat of the 2 of you. He used to say it when you were not in the room." Eleanor did not know what to say to this. She found, to her mild surprise, that she had to look away for a moment, which was not like her. "It will not be easy," her mother said, returning to the practical. "They will not know how to treat you, most of them. They will either ignore you or be uncomfortable with you, and you will have to make them comfortable without letting them mistake your effort for softness." "I know," Eleanor said. "And you will have to be twice as accurate as any man in that room, because any small error will be attributed to your being a woman, and any success will be attributed to the men who were present." "I know that too." Catherine looked at her daughter with something that was not quite a smile, but was related to one. "Good, then go and pack, and take the gray dress with the good collar, not the blue one. The blue one makes you look like a teacher." Eleanor went upstairs to the small room at the back of the house that served as both her bedroom and her study. She sat down at her desk. Outside, the October wind moved through the last leaves on the garden's single tree, pulling them loose one by one. She thought about her father. She thought about the luncheon in 1883, where she had watched Baron Hoffmann trap 3 different people with 3 different pleasantries. She thought about her father's voice, explaining the structure of a negotiating position, or the particular legal traditions of a country, or the personality of a diplomat, all the things he had told her and taught her and shared with her over the years of moving and watching and absorbing the world. She had been angry, after he died, at the waste of it, not just the waste of his own career, which had ended because of someone else's dishonesty, but the waste of everything she had learned alongside him, all of it sitting unused in a Bloomsbury house, being applied to the teaching of French verbs to the children of bankers. She opened the trunk at the bottom of her wardrobe and began deciding what to bring. 4 days. She had 4 days to prepare for something she had been, in one sense or another, preparing for her entire life. The realization of this was not dramatic. It was quiet, and a little strange, and it sat in her chest like something warm that she was slightly afraid to examine too closely in case it turned out to be fragile. She took the gray dress with the good collar. She left the blue one on its hanger. Her mother was right about most things. Eleanor had learned to pay attention to this. In the days that followed, she worked without stopping. She reviewed every document she could find related to the summit, the parties, the history of the negotiations, the individual delegations. She wrote out in her careful hand notes on each of the 7 delegations, their known positions, their likely priorities, their chief negotiators, the personalities of those negotiators, and any relevant history or context that might affect how those personalities would behave in the room. She thought about language not just as translation but as strategy. There were things that sounded one way in German and another way in Italian, and both ways were technically accurate, and choosing between them was not a neutral act. The choice of a word could make a position sound more flexible or less, more final or more open to discussion. A skilled interpreter chose not just the accurate word but the useful one, and the distinction between those two was sometimes very small and sometimes enormous. Eleanor had been doing this, in various forms, since she was 11 years old. She knew how to do it. But she had never done it at this level, with these stakes, in a room where the outcome would affect the commercial future of multiple countries. The scale of it was different from anything she had done before. She did not let herself think about what would happen if she failed. This was not because she was afraid to face the possibility, but because she had found, over the years, that contemplating failure in advance was not useful, unless you were using the contemplation to identify and correct specific risks. Generic fear of failure was just noise, and she did not have time for noise. Instead, she thought about success. She thought about walking into that room in Vienna and hearing 7 streams of language and being able to move between them like water between channels, smoothly, efficiently, without hesitation, without loss. She thought about what it would feel like to do the work she had been born to do, finally, in the room where it most mattered. And then she stopped thinking about it and went back to work. The night before departure, she sat at her desk until midnight, finishing her notes. Her mother had gone to bed. The house was quiet. The candle on her desk burned steadily in the still air. She wrote the last line of her notes, closed the notebook, and looked up at the window. London at midnight was not entirely dark. There was always some light, always some sound, always the sense of the city going on around you, regardless of whether you were paying attention to it or not. Eleanor blew out the candle and went to bed. She slept better than she had in weeks. The train left Victoria Station at 6:40 in the morning, and the British delegation boarded it in the pale, cold dark of an October dawn. There were 6 of them. Edward led, as was proper. Beside him was Charles Holt, the Foreign Office attaché assigned to the delegation as official note-taker and general administrative support. Then came Owen Marsh, a trade policy specialist who knew the coal and railway details better than anyone, and who had prepared most of the technical briefing materials. Then Peter Vale, a young man from the Foreign Secretary's office whose role was largely observational, and whose presence had been requested by the Foreign Secretary personally, possibly to ensure that someone was watching what Edward did and reporting it back. Then Gideon Cross, who managed everything and everyone with the efficiency of a very well-organized machine. And then Eleanor Voss, with her leather document case and her gray dress and her expression of calm attention, boarding a train to the continent to represent the British Crown's commercial interests at an imperial summit, as though this were simply a thing she had always done. The other 5 members of the delegation had been informed of her inclusion, but none of them had been consulted about it, because there had not been time for consultation. Edward had decided. Gideon had communicated the decision. The reactions had been varied. Charles Holt had nodded carefully, in the manner of a man who understood that he had no standing to object and was calculating whether he had any reasons to want to. He had concluded, apparently, that he did not. Owen Marsh had said, "Can she handle the technical vocabulary? Coal industry terms, railway gauge specifications, tariff structures?" He had asked this genuinely, without dismissiveness, because Owen Marsh cared primarily about whether things worked and was largely indifferent to questions of propriety. Edward had told him that he would have the opportunity to verify this on the journey, which had satisfied Owen enough to move on. Peter Vale had been more difficult. He was 26 and had been educated at a school that still believed firmly in the established order of things, and the established order of things did not include women at diplomatic negotiating tables. He had expressed this view to Gideon in terms that were polished but clear. Gideon had listened to him, agreed that it was an unconventional arrangement, and then said, with the same quiet efficiency he applied to everything, that the Duke had made his decision, and that the delegation would be proceeding accordingly. Vale had not pressed further, but he had carried his dissatisfaction with him onto the train, and it sat in the carriage beside him like a third piece of luggage. On the train, Owen Marsh sought Eleanor out within the first hour of departure. He arrived in the compartment she shared with a female diplomatic wife who was also traveling to Vienna and who had not been told who Eleanor was, and therefore treated her with the mild, general friendliness due to any respectable stranger, and he sat down across from Eleanor and opened one of his technical files. "Railway gauge specifications," he said, by way of introduction, and named a series of technical terms in English. Eleanor provided the German, French, Russian, Italian, and Hungarian equivalents without pause, then noted that the Ottoman Turkish delegation would likely not be engaging significantly on the railway specifics, and that the Italian shipping consortium would be more interested in the port connection infrastructure than the inland routes. Owen stared at her for a moment. Then he said, "Good," and opened a second file. They spent 2 hours going through the technical vocabulary. It was not scintillating conversation, but it was productive, and by the end of it, Owen Marsh had made his determination, which was that Eleanor knew what she was talking about, and that this was the relevant consideration. But he left the compartment satisfied. Eleanor returned to her notes. Edward was in the first-class carriage at the front of the train, doing what he always did when traveling for work, reviewing documents, writing notes in the margins, preparing for whatever came next. He was aware, in a peripheral way, that the delegation was settling around its new configuration, and that the settling was going well enough. Gideon brought him reports at intervals. Owen Marsh was cooperating enthusiastically. Vale was cooperating reluctantly. Holt was cooperating professionally. This was an acceptable range of outcomes. They crossed the channel at Calais, which was rough and gray and cold, and continued through France in the afternoon. The landscape changed as they moved east, the flat, ordered fields of northern France giving way to the more varied terrain of the German borderlands, and then to the long valleys and forested hills of Austria. Eleanor watched this change from her window with what felt, privately, like recognition. She had made this journey before, or one very like it, in the other direction, as a girl coming home from years of being somewhere else, watching Europe scroll past the window of a train while her father slept in the seat beside her, and her mother read, and she absorbed the landscape the way she absorbed everything. They reached Vienna late on the evening of the 11th. The city greeted them with lit gas lamps and the smell of autumn leaves and coffee, and the particular quality of air that belongs only to Vienna, slightly theatrical, slightly formal, with an undercurrent of something that could not quite be named but that Eleanor had always associated with the sense that the city was putting on a performance, and was very good at it. The delegation's hotel was on the Ringstrasse, which was deliberate. The British government had wanted accommodation that communicated a certain level of substance and confidence. The hotel was grand without being excessive, and the concierge who met them at the entrance spoke 4 languages in the first 3 minutes, which Eleanor noted and found reassuring. A city whose hotel concierges spoke 4 languages was a city that took the business of communication seriously. They were given separate rooms. Eleanor's was on the 3rd floor, quieter than the street-facing rooms and with a view over a small courtyard where a single ancient linden tree stood without its leaves. She set her trunk in the corner, unpacked the essentials, sat at the small writing desk, and opened her notebook. The summit would begin on the morning of the 14th. They had the 12th and 13th for preparation. On the afternoon of the 12th, there were to be a series of informal greeting meetings, individual delegations calling on each other, introductions being made, the surface of diplomacy being carefully maintained before the substance of it began. These were, in their own way, as important as the formal sessions. A great deal of useful information was exchanged in informal meetings, and a great deal of damage could also be done. The greeting call from Baron Hoffmann arrived first, which was not surprising. The Austrian delegation was hosting, and would want to establish the shape of things early. He arrived at the British rooms at 2 in the afternoon on the 12th, with 2 members of his own delegation and the Austrian government's chief interpreter, a careful-looking man named Ernst, who gave Eleanor a look of professional assessment when she appeared and then, to his credit, nodded with what appeared to be genuine respect. Baron Hoffmann was 61 years old, white-haired, and exactly as Eleanor remembered him from 1883, which was to say charming, controlled, and entirely accustomed to being the most experienced person in any room he entered. He spoke to Edward in German with the smooth ease of someone who did not for a moment believe that the person he was speaking to did not understand him, and who was therefore speaking for effect rather than communication. Eleanor translated. She was accurate. She was also alert. The first pleasantry that was not a pleasantry came 8 minutes into the meeting. Baron Hoffmann made a remark about the difficulty of the journey from London and expressed hope that the British delegation had arrived in good condition, and then added with a smile that he trusted the British team was prepared to approach the railway clause discussions with the same flexibility they had shown in the preliminary session in July. Eleanor translated this, then added, quietly, in English and close to Edward's ear, "He is treating the July preliminary session as an established baseline of your flexibility. The July session was informal and produced no binding agreements. If you respond to this as a pleasantry, he will reference your response later as an acknowledgement." Edward said pleasantly that the British delegation always brought both flexibility and precision to any discussion, and that he looked forward to the formal sessions where all terms could be properly defined. Eleanor rendered this in German with an additional layer of formal courtesy that softened the precision without reducing it. Baron Hoffmann smiled. He had understood that he had been deflected, and he appeared to find this interesting rather than irritating. The meeting lasted 40 minutes. 2 more such pleasantry traps appeared. Eleanor caught both. The third one she did not intercept. She let Edward handle it, because she had signaled it with a very slight movement of her hand, and he had adjusted his own response accordingly. Afterward, when the Austrian party had gone, Owen Marsh appeared from the adjoining room where he had been listening and said, to no one in particular, "How many times did he do that?" 3 significant ones, Eleanor said, and 2 that were genuinely pleasantries. Owen looked at her. "Can you tell the difference in the moment?" "Yes." He made a sound that was not quite approval but was close to it, and went back to his files. Edward caught Eleanor's eye across the room. He did not say anything, but there was something in his expression that had shifted slightly from the expression he had worn at their first meeting. Less the careful calculation of a man deciding whether to trust something he was uncertain about, and more the recognition of a man who was beginning to understand what it was he had secured. Eleanor looked away. She did not need the acknowledgement, and she was not going to show that it pleased her, because it did please her, and it was not wise to let that show in a room full of people who were still forming their opinions of how to categorize her. The Russian greeting call came the following morning. This was the one that mattered most to Eleanor, not because the Russian position was more important than the others, but because it was the one she had been most preparing for. Count Volkov was not a dramatic man. He was 55, quietly dressed, with a short gray beard and eyes that gave nothing away. He had a reputation for patience that was not the patience of indecision, but the patience of someone who had concluded that the advantage in most negotiations went to whoever could wait the longest without needing to say so. He spoke Russian to Eleanor's translation, and responded to her French with an expression that shifted, very slightly, toward interest. At the midpoint of the meeting he said something in Russian that Eleanor translated into English as, "Count Volkov expresses his appreciation for the British delegation's thoroughness, and says that he hopes the formal sessions will allow for a complete and unhurried discussion of all matters." Then she added, also in English and very quietly to Edward, he emphasized the word complete, which in Russian diplomatic usage carries the implication that there are items he believes have not yet been fully addressed. "I will watch for what those are." Count Volkov looked at Eleanor with an expression that was not quite surprise. He had not expected her to catch that. She could see, in the micro-adjustment of his posture, that he was revising his assessment of the British delegation's capabilities. Good, she thought, let him. That evening, Edward requested a meeting with the full delegation to review the day. They gathered in the sitting room of the suite reserved for delegation business, around a table covered with papers and the remnants of dinner. Edward stood at the head of the table. He went through the Russian meeting, the Hungarian meeting that had occurred in the late afternoon, and the brief encounter with the French delegation that had happened in the hotel lobby more or less by accident. He was thorough and specific, and he gave appropriate credit where it was due. He said, toward the end, that Eleanor's work in the day's informal meetings had already provided the delegation with information it would not otherwise have had, and that he expected this to continue through the formal sessions. Peter Vale's jaw was tight. Charles Holt was taking notes. Owen Marsh was already writing in the margins of something. Gideon Cross was watching Eleanor with the careful attention of someone who knew more about what was happening than he was currently saying. Eleanor said, when asked, that she had one additional observation from the day. She noted that the Hungarian chief negotiator, a man named Kovacs who had barely spoken during his delegation's own meeting, had spent the entire time watching the translation process. He had not been watching her, exactly, or Edward. He had been watching the gap between what was said in one language and what appeared in another. He was testing whether the translation was accurate and complete. "He speaks some English," she said. "Not enough to follow a fast conversation, but enough to audit a translation at the level of meaning. I expect he will use this during the formal sessions to check my work. If he identifies a discrepancy, even a minor one, he will raise it, and it will create uncertainty about the reliability of everything else I have translated." "And if the translation is accurate?" Owen asked. "Then raising the question makes him look difficult without gaining him anything, which means he will either raise it or not, depending on whether he needs a procedural complication. That tells us something about his overall strategy." The room was quiet for a moment. Vale was looking at the table. Holt had stopped writing. Edward was looking at Eleanor with the same expression he had worn yesterday when she laid out the annotated documents. Not quite admiration, not yet, but something closely related to it. "How do you know he speaks some English?" Edward asked. "He reacted to a phrase you used in English before I translated it," she said. Not a large reaction. His eyes moved very slightly. It was approximately half a second before I began translating. But the half second was enough. "Half a second," Vale said, and there was something in his voice that was not quite contempt but was in the neighborhood. "Half a second," Eleanor confirmed, without looking at him. "In a negotiating room, that is enough time for a trained observer to take a great deal of information. I expect Count Volkov would agree, though I would not ask him directly." The meeting ended shortly after. Eleanor went back to her room and sat at the small writing desk and wrote up the day's observations in the same careful, dense hand she used for everything. The linden tree in the courtyard was very still in the windless evening air. The gas lamps from the street cast their light over the stone walls. She thought about Kovacs and his careful eyes. She thought about Hoffman and his 3 pleasantry traps. She thought about Volkov and his very slight adjustment of posture. She thought about the formal sessions that would begin in 2 days and the 5 days of work that lay ahead, and she felt, running quietly underneath everything, the thing she had felt the night before departure, the sense of being, finally, in exactly the right place. She did not let herself rest on this feeling. It was not useful to rest on it. But she noted it, the way she noted everything, and found that it made the work feel different, not easier exactly, sharper, more real. She wrote until midnight, then closed her notebook and went to bed. Outside, Vienna continued its performance. She found for the second night in a row that she slept very well. The conference room was on the first floor of the Palais Schönberg, a building with high ceilings and tall windows and the specific quality of European institutional light that seems designed to make everything that happens inside it feel both significant and somehow inevitable. The table was long and oval, covered in green cloth, with chairs arranged along both sides and at both ends. Name cards had been placed at each seat, in the formal style, with the delegation's flag of country marked by a small colored pin. The British flag pin was positioned on the left side, toward the middle. Eleanor's name card was directly to Edward's right. She noticed, when she arrived before the session began, that there had been a conversation about her placement. She could tell because the name card had been moved. It was not quite aligned with the geometric logic of the other cards, meaning it had been replaced rather than placed originally. Someone had put it elsewhere, and someone else had moved it. She did not speculate about who had won that conversation. It did not matter. She was here. The Austrian delegation arrived first, as hosts, and took their positions at the head of the table. Baron Hoffman stood talking to his colleagues with the ease of a man in his own drawing room. His interpreter, Ernst, took up a secondary position to Hoffman's left, and gave Eleanor another of his precise, professional nods when she appeared. The Russian delegation came next. Count Volkov's entrance was quiet and deliberate. He found his seat, sat, opened his portfolio, and began reading, and the impression he gave was not of a man ignoring the room, but of a man who had long since made his peace with waiting, and was simply using the time productively. The Hungarian team arrived with more noise than was probably intended, the energy of a group whose internal conversations were still running. Kovacs, the English fluent one, was among them. He found his seat, looked around the table with the careful eyes Eleanor had noted yesterday, and found her. He held the look for a moment, neutral and assessing, then looked away. The French, Italian, and Ottoman delegations followed at intervals, and the room filled, and the air filled with the low murmur of many languages operating simultaneously, the sound of a room full of people who were all speaking to each other and none of whom, entirely, shared a language with anyone else. Eleanor sat in this sound and felt something that she did not have a precise English word for, but that German rendered as Heimat, a sense of being in one's natural element. Edward arrived with Gideon, Owen Marsh, and Peter Vale. He took his seat, arranged his papers, and looked once at Eleanor with the particular expression she was learning to read as his working face, composed and alert, with something underneath it that was calculating several things at once. She gave a very small nod. He returned it. Baron Hoffman opened the session in German. He welcomed the assembled parties, expressed gratitude for the historic significance of what they were undertaking, and outlined the agenda for the morning, a review of the shared terms of engagement, followed by an opening statement from each delegation on their principal concerns and interests. Eleanor translated this into English in a low, steady voice, then continued translating the opening remarks from each delegation as they followed in French, Russian, Italian, Hungarian, and Ottoman Turkish in turn. The Ottoman Turkish, rendered by a man named Farouk who had a deliberate formal delivery, was the longest and most ornamented, full of polite constructions that took twice as many words to express as the content strictly required, and Eleanor rendered it faithfully, but trimmed the ornament to what English would consider appropriate without losing any of the substance. She was aware, as she worked, of the dynamics forming around the table. The French delegation was watching the Russian delegation. The Hungarian team was watching the Austrian one. The Italian shipping consortium's chief, a compact man named Rinaldi, was watching everybody with the expression of someone who was compiling a list. And Peter Vale, somewhere to the left of Edward's peripheral vision, was doing his best to look as though the arrangement at the British end of the table was entirely normal. The first hour passed without significant incident. Statements were made, courtesies exchanged, the architecture of the formal proceedings established. Eleanor translated and noted and watched. The first real moment came during the second hour, when Baron Hoffmann introduced the question of the railway tariff structure, which was, in practice, the central issue of the entire summit. He did so with the skilled indirectness of a man who has spent decades learning how to introduce the most contentious item on the agenda, as though it were the most reasonable. The framing that invited everyone to agree that yes, of course, this was the natural next step. He used the phrase that Eleanor had been waiting for. In German, he said that the discussions should proceed from the understanding established in the July preliminary session, in which all parties had expressed willingness to consider the Austrian proposal as a working basis. Eleanor translated this, then said quietly to Edward, "The July session produced no working basis. The Austrian party is attempting to establish one retroactively. I recommend you clarify." Edward did not hesitate. He said pleasantly that he was sure all parties shared a commitment to precision, and that he wished to ensure the record was clear on the status of the July preliminary session, which to his understanding had produced no formal agreements, and would therefore not constitute a basis in the strict sense, though it had of course been a productive exchange. He said this in English. Eleanor rendered it in German, then, without being asked, in French, because the French delegation's chief had leaned forward very slightly, which told her he had the same concern. There was a pause. Baron Hoffmann looked at Edward. Then he looked at Eleanor. Then he looked back at Edward, and something in his expression shifted from the confident ease of a man operating on familiar ground to the more cautious assessment of a man who has realized that the terrain is different from what he expected. "The translation," he said in German, "was very precise." "I try to be," Eleanor said, also in German. This produced a brief, charged silence, of the kind that conference rooms generate when something unexpected has happened, and everyone is assessing whether it is good or bad, and for whom. Count Volkov broke it. He said, in Russian, that he agreed that precision was valuable, and that he would appreciate the same precision applied to the question of the railway gauge specifications in the eastern section, where the current documentation contained at least 2 inconsistencies that would need to be resolved. Eleanor translated this and noted, privately, that Volkov had just done something very useful. He had redirected the room's attention from the territorial question of whose framing would govern the proceedings to a specific technical problem that everyone needed to solve, which was exactly the kind of move that prevented conference rooms from becoming arenas. He had also, she noted, phrased his remark in a way that attributed the inconsistencies to the documentation rather than to any particular party, which was either very generous or very strategic, and she suspected the latter. The morning session ended at noon. The delegations broke for a formal lunch in the adjacent dining room, where conversations could continue in the informal register that sometimes produced more progress than the official table. Eleanor ate quickly and quietly, and spent most of the lunch hour watching the way different delegations found each other, or avoided each other, across the room. She noticed that Kovacs, the Hungarian with the careful English, had placed himself adjacent to the French delegation's chief, a man named Leblanc, and that they were engaged in a conversation that was technically in French, but that seemed to involve a great deal of mutual looking toward the Austrian table. She filed this away. Hungary and France finding common cause against the Austrian position was a development worth tracking. Owen Marsh appeared beside her at some point and said, without preamble, "The railway gauge point from Volkov. Do you know what the inconsistencies are?" 2, Eleanor said. "One is a measurement conversion error between the Austrian and Russian standard gauge specifications that results in a 12 mm discrepancy in the eastern section near Galicia. The other is a date error in the maintenance schedule that puts 2 inspection periods in overlap." Owen stared at her. "You read the technical specifications." "I read everything." He made a sound under his breath that might have been impressed, and went away to find his files. The afternoon session was longer and harder. The French delegation introduced a proposal regarding the toll structure that had the Austrian team sitting very still and the Italian representative writing quickly in his notebook, and the Russian delegation looking at each other with the kind of careful expressions that meant things were being communicated between them without words. Eleanor caught the Russian side communications where she could, in the fragments of low-voiced exchange she could pick up from her position at the table. and built a working picture of the Russian response before it was formally stated. At one point, the Ottoman Turkish representative said something that the Austrian interpreter, Ernst, translated into German in a way that was technically accurate but that missed a layer of meaning that changed the implied tone entirely. Eleanor caught it. She sat with it for 2 seconds, calculating whether to intervene, which was a delicate question. Intervening in another delegation's interpreter's translation was an unusual act. It would draw attention. It would create a moment of awkwardness that some people would carry with them. But the mistranslation shifted the Ottoman position from a cautious neutrality to an apparent alignment with France on the toll question, which was not what the Ottoman representative had said, and if the record stood as Ernst had rendered it, it would create a false picture of the room. She turned to Edward and said very quietly, "I need to make a correction to the Austrian translation of the Ottoman statement. It will be brief, and I will frame it as a clarification." Edward looked at her. He had perhaps a second and a half to decide. "Do it," he said. She spoke in French, which was the most neutral language in the room, the one most likely to be understood by the most parties while belonging to no one's home delegation. She said that she wished to offer a small clarification on the previous statement, for the benefit of the record, and that the Turkish term used carried a specific shade of meaning that was perhaps better rendered as cautious interest rather than active support. Ernst looked at her. The Austrian delegation looked at Ernst. The Ottoman representative looked at his own hands for a moment, and then said, in Ottoman Turkish, something that Eleanor translated in the same moment, "The interpreter is correct. I thank her for the clarification." The room absorbed this. Then Baron Hoffmann said, in German, that he appreciated the delegation's commitment to accuracy, and there was in his voice something that was not quite respect but was making its way there. The session ended at 5. The delegations filed out in their various directions. Edward waited until the room had largely cleared, then said, without preamble, "The correction was well done." "It was necessary," Eleanor said. "I know. I'm saying it was well done in the manner as well as the act. You chose the right language and the right framing." She gathered her papers. She was aware that she was being measured, and that the measurement was positive, and she was aware that she had feelings about this that she was not going to examine in the middle of a conference room. "Ernst is a good interpreter," she said. "He caught the technical vocabulary accurately. The tonal layer is harder. It requires knowing the culture as well as the language. Do you know all of them? The cultures?" She looked at him. "Well enough." Edward nodded slowly. "The Hungarian, Kovacs. You were right about him this morning. He checked your translation of at least 3 statements." "4, she said. "The third one I am not entirely certain about. It might have been something else." He looked at her for a moment with the same expression she was beginning to associate with recalibration. A man adjusting his internal map of something. "Will that continue?" "Almost certainly. If I remain accurate, he will stop raising it overtly. The checking will continue, but it will become part of the background rather than an active challenge. That is probably the best outcome. And if you're not accurate, then we have a different problem." She closed her document case. "I intend to be accurate." She left before he could say anything further, because she was tired in the specific way that demanding intellectual work made her tired. Not physically, but in the part of the mind that had to be constantly active and alert, the part that could not afford to miss anything. She needed an hour of quiet before dinner and the evening's work. She got 40 minutes before Gideon knocked on her door with a message from Owen Marsh, who had found the railway gauge documents and had 16 questions about the Russian specifications and wanted to go through them before morning. She sighed, stood, picked up her notebook, and went next door. At 10 that evening, Edward was still in the delegation's sitting room, reviewing his notes on the day's sessions, when Gideon came in with the end-of-day tea and a brief summary of the other delegation's evening movements, gathered from the hotel's discreet but informative observation. The French and Hungarian delegation leaders had dined together. The Russian delegation had dined privately in their rooms. The Ottoman representative had been seen in conversation with the Italian in the lobby for approximately half an hour. Edward read the summary. He set it down and thought about the shape of what was forming in the room, the alliances, the tensions, the individual calculations that every one of those men was running and rerunning as they processed the day's events. He thought about Eleanor. He had known, coming into this summit, that the absence of Franklin Gray would be felt as a significant disadvantage. He had arranged Eleanor Voss's inclusion as a solution to a specific problem, the way you arranged any solution to any specific problem. You identified the gap, you found what would fill it, and you proceeded. He had not thought beyond that. He had been in enough professional situations to know that thinking too far beyond the immediate problem was a way of spending energy you needed for the immediate problem. But the day had shown him something he had not quite anticipated. It was not just that Eleanor translated accurately. It was that she translated with judgment. The judgment of someone who understood not just the words but the architecture of negotiation. The catch about the Austrian framing, the correction of Ernst's translation, the observation about Kovacs and his checking, the note about the French-Hungarian dinner conversation that she had spotted at lunch and that Gideon's summary had now confirmed. These were not the contributions of a translator. They were the contributions of someone who was reading the room with the same level of skill that he was trying to apply himself. Edward picked up his pen and made a note in the margin of his day summary. He wrote, "Ask her, tomorrow, what she thinks the Russian position actually is, not the stated position, the actual one." He was curious what she would say. He went to bed at midnight and slept 6 hours, which was more than he had expected and probably what he needed. And when he woke at 6 to the gray Vienna morning, he dressed and sat at his own small writing desk and drank coffee, and thought about the day ahead, and found that beneath the careful, calculated thinking of a man preparing for a difficult day of important work, there was something that was almost, quietly, anticipation. He attributed this to the summit. It was a reasonable thing to be anticipating. The summit was important and interesting, and he was doing his job. He did not look at the reason too closely. He had learned, over the years, that there were some things that were better understood slowly. By the third day of formal sessions, the room had settled into the specific rhythm of a high-level negotiation that has moved past the stage of formal positioning and entered the more dangerous territory of actual dealing. This was the territory Eleanor had been waiting for. The first 2 days had been, in the language of diplomacy, constructive. Statements had been made, frameworks had been proposed and gently challenged. The technical groundwork had been laid by people like Owen Marsh and his equivalents in the other delegations who spoke the language of tons per mile and track gauge standards and load capacity in the way that musicians speak about key signatures, completely naturally, in a way that seemed almost separate from the political conversation happening simultaneously above it. Eleanor had moved between these two levels, the technical and the diplomatic, the specific and the strategic, with the ease of someone who had been doing it in one form or another since she was a teenager. And the effect had been that the British delegation entered day 3 with a clearer picture of the room than any of them had expected to have. Edward had asked her, on the morning of day 2, what she thought the Russian position actually was, not the stated one, the actual one. She had told him. Volkov was not primarily interested in the railway concessions, which was the formal subject of the summit. He was interested in the coal price stabilization mechanism that was embedded, somewhat obscurely, in Clause 7 of the proposed framework. A clause that most of the other delegations were treating as secondary, but that, if properly structured, would give the Russian coal interests a significant degree of influence over pricing across the Eastern European market for the next 15 years. Volkov had come to Vienna for Clause 7. Everything else was preparation and positioning. Edward had looked at her for a long moment after she said this. Then he had asked how she knew. She had explained. The way Volkov asked questions in the first session had been oriented consistently toward the preconditions of Clause 7 without ever addressing the clause directly. The way his delegation's note-taker moved in the second session, angling his writing, covering the page slightly, suggested he was tracking specific language in real time. The way Volkov himself had responded to the French toll proposal was with a slightly too easy agreeableness that suggested the toll question was not a priority for him, which could only make sense if something else was. Clause 7, Edward said. Clause 7. He had gone away to talk to Owen Marsh about Clause 7. On the morning of day 3, the room was tighter than it had been. The delegations had each spent their evenings calculating, and the calculations had produced new postures. The French delegation was visibly in communication with the Hungarians. They had found a shared concern about the Eastern Railway route that put both of them in quiet tension with the Austrian framework. The Italians were watching this developing alignment with interest, considering, apparently, which side of it they wanted to be on. The Ottoman delegation maintained its formal cordiality with everyone while revealing nothing. And Count Volkov was waiting. Eleanor watched him. She had been watching him since day 1, cataloging his habits and his tells and the way he used silence as a tool. He was very good at silence. Most negotiators filled silence because silence felt like a failure of communication, a gap that needed to be covered. Volkov let silences stand. He let them develop their own weight, and then let other people break them, and whoever broke the silence first revealed something about their level of comfort with the current state of things. He had been waiting for Clause 7 to come onto the floor. Baron Hoffmann, who was not as opaque as he believed himself to be, brought it up at 11 in the morning, in the third session of the day, framing it as a housekeeping matter. just a few definitional points that needed to be agreed before the framework could be finalized. He said this in German with the easy confidence of a man presenting something uncontroversial. Eleanor translated it into English, noted it in French and Italian, and then watched the room respond. Volkov set down his pen. It was a small gesture, but she caught it. He had been using his pen continuously for 3 days. He was not going to need it for what came next. Leblanc, the French chief, said in French that he was glad the clause was being raised, as there were questions about the pricing mechanism that his delegation would wish to address. Eleanor translated this into German and English simultaneously, which was technically demanding but had become easier over the 3 days as the rhythm of the room became familiar. Kovacs, the Hungarian, said something in Hungarian to his own delegation that Eleanor caught without appearing to turn toward them, a low sentence about the timing being earlier than expected. She filed this away. The Hungarians had expected this discussion to happen later in the proceedings. That suggested they had been planning their approach for a later moment and would now need to adapt. Baron Hoffman began speaking about the definitional question in what sounded like general terms but was, Eleanor recognized, a very specific framing of the pricing mechanism that embedded the Austrian position as the default. He was good at this. He had spent 40 years doing it. Eleanor translated his words accurately and precisely, including the embedded framing, and said nothing additional, because the moment for additional commentary was not yet here. Edward needed to hear this clearly first. The intervention, if there was to be one, would come from understanding the full shape of what Hoffman was doing, not from reacting to the first part of it. Volkov spoke when Hoffman finished. He spoke at length, which was unusual. He had spent 3 days in relative economy of statement. Now he opened up, and what he produced was a careful, detailed, well-prepared argument for a specific structure of the pricing mechanism, a structure that was not identical to what he had previously suggested in the preliminary sessions, but that had evolved in a way that was, Eleanor recognized, a response to the previous 2 days' conversations. He had been listening. He had adapted. His position was not fixed. It was strategic. She translated every word, at full pace, without losing the thread. At 3 points she paused to give Edward a brief, verbatim aside on a specific phrase whose legal implications would not come through in a smooth translation. Things that required a note like, in Russian commercial law this phrase carries the implication of, and then the implication, delivered in the low, continuous voice she had trained herself to use, that was simultaneously part of the translation stream and separate from it, audible to Edward and Gideon but not projected across the table. When Volkov finished, there was a pause. Leblanc of France said, in French, that Count Volkov had articulated the central concern very well, and that the French delegation shared the view that the pricing mechanism required a stability element. He added, carefully, that this stability element should be neutral, not weighted toward any existing coal-producing interest. Eleanor translated this. As she did, she was aware of 2 things simultaneously. First, that Leblanc had just aligned France with Russia on the fundamental structure, and second, that Baron Hoffman had heard this and was managing, with considerable professional skill, a reaction that he did not want the room to see. Baron Hoffman is not happy with the French alignment, she said quietly to Edward, in the gap of a half-second between Leblanc's statement and the room's response. He did not expect it. He was depending on French neutrality. Can you tell why? The Austrian pricing structure depends on having the French consumption figures as an unaligned baseline. If France commits to the stability element, the Austrian baseline calculation changes. Edward processed this for approximately 2 seconds. Then he said, in a perfectly ordinary voice, that the British delegation also saw merit in the stability element and would be interested in examining the specific structure Count Volkov had described. This was not a dramatic statement. It was not a confrontation or a challenge. It was a quiet addition of weight to one side of a scale that was already tipping. Baron Hoffman looked at Edward. Volkov looked at Edward. There was a shift in the room. Not large, not theatrical. The kind of shift that happens in a room of skilled people when the shape of something important has changed and everyone has registered it. Rinaldi of Italy, who had spent 3 days watching everybody with his list-compiling expression, said in Italian that the Italian delegation would also find clarity on this point very useful. Eleanor translated this. Then she said, very quietly, to Edward only, he is not committing. He is positioning himself to be on whatever side wins. Watch him. 4 of the 7 delegations had now expressed at least partial interest in the stability element. The 5th, the Ottoman delegation, said nothing, but their chief's posture had shifted very slightly toward the majority. The Hungarians were conferring in low voices. Baron Hoffman spoke again. His German was still smooth, still controlled, but there was an edge to it now, the precise, careful edge of a man working harder than he wanted anyone to know. He said that the stability element, as an abstract principle, was not something the Austrian delegation objected to, but that the specific implementation required careful consideration of existing infrastructure commitments, and that the current proposal would need significant revision before it could serve as a working basis. Eleanor translated this and added, very quietly to Edward, "He has moved from framing the proposal as settled to describing it as a working basis. He is retreating from the stronger position. He will need to bring his delegation a face-saving path out of the corner they're in." "Can we give him one?" Edward asked, just as quietly. She thought about it for 3 seconds. "Yes. If you propose a review mechanism, a formal committee to examine the implementation details before the clause is finalized. It gives him a process he can represent to his government as Austrian oversight without changing the substance." "Will Volkov accept that?" "Only if the committee has genuinely neutral membership. He will not accept anything that gives Austria a de facto veto. Then propose genuinely neutral membership." "A rotating chair," she said, "with each delegation taking 1 day of the committee proceedings. Gives everyone equal formal authority. No one can claim the process is biased." Edward straightened very slightly. Then he said, in the clean, measured English that Eleanor had come to recognize as his formal register, that the British delegation would like to suggest a procedural mechanism that might assist in moving forward on the implementation question. He described it precisely as she had outlined it. She translated it into German as he spoke, then French, then Italian, without waiting to be asked. Volkov was the first to respond. He said, in Russian, that this mechanism appeared constructive, and that his delegation would be interested in discussing its specific terms. Eleanor translated this and allowed herself, for approximately 1 second, to feel the particular satisfaction of a thing working exactly as it was intended to. The afternoon session continued for 3 more hours. The review mechanism was discussed, adjusted, disputed, adjusted again, and eventually accepted in principle by all 7 parties. It was not a small achievement. It was, in fact, the kind of procedural breakthrough that would later allow the substantive discussions to move forward. And it had happened because 4 people in various corners of the room had done their thinking correctly. Volkov with his patience, LeBlanc with his alignment, Edward with his timing, and Eleanor with her mapping of the paths between all of them. When the session broke at 4:30, Owen Marsh caught up to Eleanor in the corridor and walked beside her for a moment without speaking. Then he said, "You're not just translating." "No," she agreed. "You're navigating." "Yes." He thought about this for a moment. "Are you going to tell the Duke what you think he should do each day, or will he figure it out at some point?" "He figures it out," Eleanor said. "I give him information. What he does with it is his." Owen made the sound again, the one that had started as a hedge and had gradually become something more definite. Then he said, "Right," and went off to find his railway gauge files. Eleanor went back to her room and sat at her desk and wrote for an hour. She wrote up the day's session in full detail. Not just what was said, but what was communicated by the way it was said. The postures and the pauses and the small movements that told the real story running under the official one. She wrote it in the clear, dense hand that was her natural written voice, and she did not stop until she had recorded everything she could still hold clearly in her mind. Then she set down her pen and looked out at the courtyard and the linden tree. It had been the best day of work in her professional life, such as it was, and she was not going to say that out loud, and she was not going to indulge in it more than she already was, which was, very quietly, privately, for exactly 5 minutes, she let herself feel how good it had been. Then she picked up her pen and went back to work. The 4th evening began quietly, which was how the worst evenings in Eleanor's experience tended to begin. Dinner for the delegations was informal. The hotel's dining room remained available, but there was no official program, no required attendance, no formal seating. People ate when they chose and with whom they chose, and the conversations that happened over food were technically private and therefore often more substantive than the official ones. Eleanor ate early and alone, which was her preference. She was at a corner table with her notebook and a plate of Viennese beef and a glass of water, and she was going through her notes on Clause 7 and the review mechanism and the specific language that had been proposed and accepted in principle, checking it against her memory of the Russian original and the German rendering and the English summary, making sure that the 4 versions she had worked with through the afternoon remained precisely aligned. She was almost finished with this when she became aware of a conversation happening at the table to her right and slightly behind her. A table she had not been paying attention to because it had been empty when she sat down. She became aware of it not because she was trying to listen, but because she was accustomed, by long training, to processing sound in the background even while concentrating on something else. The voices at the table behind her were two members of the Hungarian delegation, and they were speaking in Hungarian. This was not in itself unusual. The hotel was full of delegates speaking their own languages with their colleagues. What caught Eleanor's attention was the word British, and then, a moment later, the word for interpreter, and then a phrase that she needed to hear more of before she could properly place it. She did not turn. She did not appear to listen. She continued to read her notes and make small marks in the margins and drink her water. On the surface, to anyone watching, she was a woman finishing her dinner alone. She was also hearing every word. The two men were speaking in the casual, rapid Hungarian of people who are not being careful, who are tired and eating dinner, and have dropped the formal register of the conference room. One was Kovács, the note-taker and English-fluent observer. The other was a younger member of the delegation, a man Eleanor had placed as a logistics aide, probably in his mid-20s. Neither of them had any particular reason to think that the quiet woman at the corner table spoke their language. The younger man was saying something about the review mechanism that had been agreed in principle that afternoon. Kovács was listening and responding. The younger man was concerned about the composition of the proposed committee, specifically about whether the neutral rotating chair structure would, in practice, give the Austrian and Russian delegations more influence than the formal mechanism suggested, because both Austria and Russia had more experienced committee representatives, and would be able to control the pace and tone of proceedings even without controlling the chair. This was a reasonable concern. Eleanor noted it, but it was not what stopped her. What stopped her was the next part of the conversation, which shifted, and the shift was so sudden that she nearly betrayed herself by going still. Kovács said that it did not matter, in any case, because Count Volkov had already spoken privately with Baron Hoffmann the previous evening, the third evening, while Eleanor had been going through railway specifications with Owen Marsh, and that the Russian and Austrian delegations had reached a private understanding on Clause 7, that would allow them to present a joint recommendation to the other parties in the final session tomorrow. A joint recommendation that had been drafted, Kovács said, in terms that were not precisely what the other parties had agreed to that afternoon. The younger man asked what the difference was. Kovács explained it. Eleanor kept her face neutral. She kept her hand moving over her notebook page, making marks. She heard every word. The difference was not catastrophic. It was not a fraud in any gross sense, but it was significant. The language in the private understanding between Russia and Austria on the pricing mechanism would, if adopted, shift the effective control of the stabilization fund to a committee with an Austrian majority in its first 3 years of operation. This was not what the afternoon's agreement had described. The afternoon's agreement had described a genuinely neutral mechanism. The private understanding described something that would be presented as the neutral mechanism but would, in practice, function differently. Kovács said that Hungary intended to raise this discrepancy in the final session. He said it with the exhausted directness of a man who knows he is about to make things difficult, and has accepted this. The younger man asked if they would have support from the French. Kovács said he was not certain. He said the Italian delegation was still undecided. He said the timing would matter. If Hungary raised the discrepancy at the wrong moment, it would look like disruption rather than legitimate concern, and they might not get the traction they needed. Eleanor finished her dinner. She closed her notebook. She left the dining room. She went to the corridor, and then to the stairs, and then to the third floor, and then she stood outside Edward's room and knocked. He answered within 30 seconds, which suggested he had been awake and working. He was in his evening clothes, without the jacket, with the look of a man who had been at his desk. He took in her expression, which she knew was controlled but was not, at that particular moment, as controlled as it usually was. "Come in," he said, and stepped back. She came in. She sat in the chair by the writing desk. He sat on the arm of the other chair, which was the posture of a man prepared to stand up again quickly if the situation required it. She told him. She told him exactly what she had heard, in sequence, with the Hungarian phrases rendered into English as precisely as she could, and she told him her interpretation of what it meant. She was scrupulous about the distinction between what she had actually heard and what she had inferred from it, which was important, because the appropriate response depended on which parts were established fact and which parts were analysis. Edward was very still while she spoke. This was different from the stillness he wore as a professional default, the composed, calculated stillness of a man controlling his register in a meeting. This was a different kind of still, the kind that comes from hearing something that requires complete attention, and from giving it that attention without wasting any of it on reaction. When she finished, he said nothing for a moment. Then, "Are you certain about the pricing committee structure? The 3-year Austrian majority?" "Yes." Kovacs described it clearly. And Kovacs is reliable? He's not running a different game, telling the younger man something false to see what gets back to us. Eleanor considered this. It was a fair question. Counterintelligence at diplomatic meetings was not unheard of, and Kovacs was sharp enough to attempt it. But she had watched Kovacs for 4 days. She had watched the way he spoke with his own delegation, the way he tracked the room, the way he had spent the first 2 days checking her translations. He was a careful man who did not waste energy on elaborate maneuvers. I do not believe so, she said. His concern about the timing of Hungary's objection was genuine. A man running a false narrative for our benefit does not worry about the timing of his own move. Edward nodded. He stood. He moved to the window, which was his thinking position. She had noticed this in meetings, that he stood at windows when he was processing something important, as though the act of looking out helped him arrange what was inside. If this is accurate, he said, the Russian and Austrian delegations have spent 4 days negotiating in the room, while having already reached a private agreement that contradicts what the room produced. That agreement will be presented tomorrow as a joint recommendation. Yes. And Hungary intends to contest it. Yes. But Kovacs is not certain they will have enough support in the moment. The French are undecided. And Italy is watching to see which way it goes. Yes. He was quiet again. She waited. She was good at waiting. She had learned it from years of rooms where the important thing was not to fill a silence before you were ready. Why are you telling me this? He said. He said it facing the window, without turning, and the question was genuine, not an accusation, not a test, but an actual question. She had expected it, because you needed to know. He turned. His expression in the lamplight was different from the versions of it she had catalogued over the past 4 days. Less composed, more direct. She had the sense of looking at something that was more the actual person, and less the professional function. I asked a question I already knew the answer to, he said. I apologize. She was mildly surprised by the apology. It was not the kind of thing she had expected from him. At this point in the proceedings, in this context, she filed it away. You're trying to decide what to do with it, she said. Yes. There are 3 options as I see it. She could not help thinking it through, now that she had begun. It was simply how her mind worked. First, do nothing tonight. Allow tomorrow's session to proceed as the Russian and Austrian delegations expect. Let Hungary raise the discrepancy if they choose to, and assess the room's response in the moment. The advantage is that we do not show our hand. The disadvantage is that we enter the session without a clear strategy, and depend on Hungary moving at the right moment. He was watching her. Second, speak to Leblanc tonight, the French. If the British and French positions align before the morning session, Hungary will not be facing a 2-against-5 situation when they raise the discrepancy. The advantage is that we enter with allies and sufficient weight. The disadvantage is that Leblanc may already know about the private understanding, in which case approaching him reveals that we know too, and the question of how we know becomes a complication. She paused. Third, she said, speak to Volkov directly. Not tonight. It is too late and the request would be conspicuous. But before the morning session, privately, make it clear that the British delegation is aware that the private understanding exists, and that the British delegation's support for the final agreement tomorrow will depend on the actual implementation, reflecting what was agreed in the room, not what was agreed privately. Edward said, that is a significant risk. If Volkov decides to deny the private understanding, we are in a worse position than if we had said nothing. Yes, but Volkov will not deny it. Why not? Because he is a man who values precision, Eleanor said, and he knows that I was in the dining room. He may not know that I speak Hungarian, but he is careful enough to have noticed that I was there. If he suspected, even slightly, that I had heard something relevant, he would factor that into his calculation. A denial from a man who suspects you already know would be a different kind of exposure than a denial from a man who is confident you know nothing. Edward looked at her for a long moment. The lamp on the writing desk cast its steady light over the room. Outside, Vienna was quiet in the late evening, the performance of the city having settled into its nighttime register. Which would you do? He asked. She had thought about this for the 2 minutes it had taken her to walk from the dining room to his door. She had thought about it in the corridor and on the stairs and standing outside his room before knocking. She had an answer. Option 3, she said, but it must be you who makes the approach, and it must be in a register that is direct without being confrontational. You are not accusing Volkov of dishonesty. You are making clear that the British delegation's support for the final agreement requires precision in its terms, and that you would welcome a brief discussion of the implementation details before the session tomorrow. Leave the rest implied. He will understand the implication. Edward looked at the window. He looked at the desk. He looked at her. "All right," he said. "Can you draft the message?" To Volkov. Formal, correct Russian. The kind a senior official would send to another senior official requesting a brief professional meeting. She reached for the notebook she had kept under her arm throughout the conversation. She opened it to a blank page. She wrote the message in Russian, in the formal register. In approximately 4 minutes, she handed it to him. He read it. She had written it in the Cyrillic script, which he clearly could not read. He looked up at her. "What does it say?" She translated it, sentence by sentence. He listened. Then he handed it back. "That is exactly right. Send it. I am not the one who should. You are the person in this delegation who can write it correctly, and the correctness matters more than the protocol of who delivers it. Put my name below it. Have it sent by the hotel's messenger service, not by anyone from the delegation. At this hour it will reach him within 20 minutes and he will have overnight to consider it." She added his name below the message in the formal Russian signature style. She went back to her own room and rang for the hotel's house messenger service and sent the note, paying from her own small travel fund rather than the delegation's, because she did not want it on any record that could be checked. Then she went back to her room and sat at her desk and did not work. For the first time in 4 days, she sat without her notebook and without a document in front of her and simply thought. She thought about what she had done, not just tonight, but all of it. The 4 days of sessions, the translations, the corrections, the navigation, the information she had gathered and relayed, the strategies she had outlined. All of this on behalf of a man she had met less than a week ago, in a context she had never worked in before, on behalf of a government that had twice refused her services. She was not sorry. That was what she found when she examined it honestly. She was not sorry, and she was not resentful, and she was not conflicted. She had done the work because the work needed doing and she could do it, and those two facts together were sufficient justification. The injustice of the Foreign Office rejections was real, but it was not a reason to do the work less well. It was not a reason to withhold the hearing she had had in the dining room, or the message she had drafted, or any of the dozens of things she had done over 4 days that had quietly shaped the direction of a summit that the British government cared about deeply. She did not know what came after this. She did not know whether the summit would succeed, whether tomorrow's session would go as she hoped, whether Volkov would respond to the note in the way she had calculated. She was not certain of any of it. But she had done the work correctly. She was certain of that. She went to bed at midnight. The linden tree in the courtyard was a dark shape against the night sky, still and bare. She looked at it for a moment before closing the curtains. Then, she closed her eyes and slept. And whatever the morning brought, she was ready for it. Count Volkov's reply came at 6 in the morning. It was delivered to Edward's room by the hotel messenger, a folded note in Russian on plain paper with no letterhead. Edward took it to Eleanor's room immediately, knocked, and stood in the corridor while she read it. She read it twice. Volkov had written, in the clean, efficient Russian of a senior official who uses words the way a careful carpenter uses timber, only what the structure requires, nothing more, nothing wasted. That he would be pleased to meet with the Duke of Harrowfield at 8 o'clock, before the morning session, in the small reading room on the second floor that was available to all delegation members. He said that the Duke's attention to implementation detail was exactly the kind of commitment that productive agreements required. He said nothing about the pricing committee or the private understanding or any of the specifics that Edward's note had carefully not mentioned. He did not need to. The acceptance was the message. Eleanor folded the note and held it for a moment. She looked at the door of her own room, which she had not closed, then at the corridor, which was still empty at this hour, then at Edward, who was watching her. "He is coming," she said. "I understood that much from his agreement to meet. No, I mean he is coming to make it right." A man who had decided to brazen it out would have sent a note asking what specific implementation concerns the Duke had in mind. Volkov sent a straight acceptance. He has already decided that the private understanding with Austria needs to be adjusted. Edward was quiet for a moment. He was in his morning clothes, clearly having risen and dressed quickly when the note arrived. In the plain corridor light, he looked somewhat different from the formal version of him that sat at the conference table, less a representative of a title, and more a person who had been awake for some hours doing something difficult. "You expected this?" "I assessed it as the most probable outcome. I am not always right about probable outcomes, but you are often right." She did not answer that. It was not a question that needed an answer. "Come to the meeting," he said. "You do not need me in the meeting. You need me for the language, but Volkov's written Russian is clear and I have given you a translation. In the room, his English is sufficient for a direct conversation. He has been using his interpreter as a professional courtesy, not a necessity. I know. Come anyway." He paused, not to translate, to think. "I would like a second person thinking in that room." Eleanor considered this for exactly as long as it required. "I will come," she said. At 8 o'clock, they were in the small reading room on the second floor. Edward, Eleanor, and a single aide from his delegation who functioned as a witness. Volkov arrived alone, which was also a message. No interpreter, no aide, no official witness of his own. This was a meeting between two people who trusted each other enough for it. He sat across from Edward. He looked at Eleanor with an expression that confirmed what she had suspected. He had known she was in the dining room. Whether he had known she understood Hungarian, or had simply assessed the risk and acted accordingly, she could not be certain, but the acknowledgement in his look was clear enough. Edward began. He said that he was grateful for the Count's willingness to meet, and that he wanted to discuss the implementation framework for the pricing mechanism that had been agreed the previous afternoon, as the British delegation had some technical questions about the committee structure. Volkov said, in English that was careful and precise, that he had also had some thoughts on this overnight, and that he believed there were elements of the proposed committee structure that could be clarified to everyone's benefit. They talked for 40 minutes. Eleanor did not translate. She did not offer analysis. She sat and listened and watched. And once, when Edward was formulating a response to a specific point about the committee's voting procedure, she placed a brief, light pressure on the notebook in her hands, which was a signal she had established with him on day 2 for, "Approach this carefully." He received it and shifted his register from direct to exploratory, which was the right move. By the time they finished, Volkov had agreed to propose a revised committee structure in the morning session that would address the 3-year voting majority question, without explicitly acknowledging that the original private understanding had included it. It was, in the language of these things, a graceful correction. Nothing admitted, nothing accused, nothing on record that could embarrass anyone. Simply a revised proposal that was, in fact, what the afternoon session had agreed to. After Volkov left, Edward sat for a moment in the small room. Eleanor waited. "He knew," Edward said. "That I understood Hungarian? I believe so. Or he suspected it sufficiently to act on the possibility. And he came anyway. He came because the alternative was a difficult session and the risk of the whole agreement unraveling. Volkov wants the agreement. He wanted Clause 7. He would rather have a version of Clause 7 that he can live with than lose Clause 7 entirely." Edward looked at her. He had a habit, she had noticed, of being very direct when he was thinking something clearly. Not the careful directness of professional interaction, but the simpler directness of someone stating a fact they have recently arrived at. "You understood all of this last night, in the dining room, in the time it took you to eat your dinner." "I had been watching the delegations for 4 days, she said. "Last night was the piece that completed the picture." He stood. He picked up his notebook, the one she had seen him use consistently across the 4 days, filled with his tight, precise handwriting. He said, without looking at her, "When I was 18, my tutor told me that the most useful skill in the world was the ability to walk into a room and understand it, to see what was actually happening rather than what you were supposed to see." He paused. He said he had met perhaps 3 people in his life who could genuinely do it. She said nothing. He looked at her. "I have met one more." She looked back at him steadily. It took some effort to do this without showing what she felt, because what she felt was something large and somewhat complicated and not appropriate to show in a second-floor reading room 40 minutes before the most important session of the summit. "We should prepare for the morning," she said. "Yes," he agreed. They went back to their rooms. Eleanor sat at her desk and did not immediately pick up her notebook. She sat with her hands in her lap and looked at the courtyard and the linden tree, and thought about the thing she was carefully not thinking about. She thought about it precisely long enough to identify it accurately, categorize it honestly, and then set it aside in the part of her mind that held things she would deal with later, when later was a time that existed. Then she picked up her notebook and began preparing for the morning session. The session began at 10. Volkov presented the revised committee structure within the first 20 minutes, framing it as a refinement of the previous day's agreement that addressed some procedural questions he had been considering. He said it with complete smoothness. Baron Hoffmann's reaction was a masterpiece of controlled acceptance. His expression showed nothing except a very faint moment of calculation, and then he agreed that the refinement was sensible. Kovacs, the Hungarian, looked at Eleanor. She did not look back. She was translating. The French delegation's Leblanc made a brief, warm statement about the collaborative spirit of the proceeding, which was his way of acknowledging, for the record, that whatever had happened between last night and this morning had been resolved in a way he found satisfactory. He did not know what had happened. He did not need to. The rest of the morning session was procedural. The review committee terms were formalized. The membership was agreed. The timetable for the committee's first meeting was set. It was thorough, careful work. And by the time the lunch break arrived, the summit had produced its first concrete structural agreement. Owen Marsh appeared during the break with the look of a man who has been waiting very patiently to be included in a conversation. He cornered Eleanor near the dining room entrance. "The revised committee structure," he said. "It's different from yesterday's proposal." "Yes. Better." "Yes. Did something happen this morning?" "The Count had a productive evening," Eleanor said. Owen looked at her for a long moment. "Right," he said, for possibly the 5th time in the week, and went to get lunch. The afternoon session turned to the coal pricing mechanism itself, the substantive content of Clause 7 that the committee structure was designed to govern. This was where the summit became genuinely technical, and where Eleanor's work changed in character. The morning had required navigation. The afternoon required precision. She translated technical terms across 6 languages for 5 hours, holding the chain of meaning intact across each shift. She caught 2 further errors in third-party translations. The French interpreter made one small mistake on a tonnage calculation that Eleanor flagged discreetly, and the Italian delegation's aide rendered a legal phrase in a way that was possible but not ideal, which Eleanor noted in her record without intervening, as the potential consequence was minor, and the disruption of intervening was not worth it. At the end of the afternoon, when the session finally broke at 6 o'clock and the delegations gathered their papers and made their polite good evenings, Eleanor sat for a moment in her chair at the empty table while the room cleared. She was tired. Not defeated tired, but thoroughly spent tired, the kind that comes from a full day of work done at the highest possible level of attention. Her hand, which had been writing almost continuously, ached in the specific way of long writing sessions. Her mind was still moving, still processing, still compiling the threads of the day's events. The table was almost empty. Edward was speaking quietly with Gideon at the far end. Owen Marsh was packing his files with the focused efficiency of a man already thinking about the next thing. Peter Vale had left early and quickly. Charles Holt was making final notes. Edward finished with Gideon and came down the table to where Eleanor was still sitting. He did not sit. He stood with his hands resting on the table's edge, and he looked at the table surface for a moment, and then he said, very quietly, "What happened in the dining room last night? The way you handled it. The note to Volkov. The meeting this morning. I want you to know that this delegation succeeded today, because of those choices." She looked up at him. He was standing at an angle to the lamp, and the light was different from the morning's corridor light. Warmer, less exposing, more like the light of a real room, where real things were said between people who meant them. "The delegation had good resources," she said. "Owen Marsh has been extraordinary on the technical material. Gideon has managed the logistics without a single failure. She paused. You make decisions under pressure quickly and without visible uncertainty, which is not a small thing in that room." "I was uncertain this morning," he said, "about the meeting with Volkov." "I know. You were right to be. It was a risk. You told me it was the right choice. I told you it was the most probable correct choice. Those are different things." He looked at her. The expression was the one she had catalogued as recalibration, but it had more complexity in it now, more layers. She was beginning to find it harder to read as simply professional. "May I ask you something?" he said. "You may." "In the dining room, what were you going to do if the conversation had been about something else, something that had nothing to do with the summit?" She considered this. "I would have sat and had my dinner and gone back to work." "You would not have been tempted to use something unrelated to the summit?" "No." "Why not? You are clearly—" He stopped. "Clearly what?" He looked slightly uncomfortable, which was a version of him she had not seen before. "Clearly capable of using information in a way that produces results." She held his gaze. "Because using information that has nothing to do with the work is a different kind of thing. I was in that room to do a specific job. I heard something relevant to that job. Hearing something relevant to my specific function and acting on it is called doing the work well. Hearing something unrelated and acting on it would be a different act entirely." She paused. "I did not come to Vienna to accumulate advantage. I came to do the work." He was quiet for a long moment. Something in his expression had moved past recalibration into something she did not have a precise name for, but that she found, to her mild inconvenience, she was having a reaction to. "I should let you rest," he said. "Yes." He straightened. He did not leave immediately. He stood for one more moment, looking not at her, but at some point slightly to the left of her, the way people look when they are thinking something they have not quite finished thinking. Then he said, in a voice that was quieter than his usual register, "For what it is worth, and I expect my opinion is of limited relevance to you, you are the best person in the room, any room." He left before she could respond. Eleanor sat at the empty table for a while longer. The lamp burned. The room was very quiet now. She thought about what he had said. She thought about the fact that no one had said anything like it to her before, not in a professional context. And she thought about the fact that she did not know how to receive it gracefully, because she had not had occasion to learn. She had had occasion to receive dismissal, which she had learned to handle very well. She had had occasion to receive polite acknowledgement of adequate work, which she could manage comfortably. She had not had occasion to receive that. She stood. She gathered her things. She went back to her room and sat at the desk and wrote up the day's session with the same thoroughness she applied every evening. She wrote it all down, including the conversation at the end, because she recorded everything. When she reached the last exchange, she paused with her pen on the page for a moment. Then she wrote it accurately, exactly as it had occurred, and closed the notebook and went to bed. Tomorrow was the last day. The summit would either succeed or it would not, and by 6 in the evening it would be over, and she would have her answer, and then she would go home to Bloomsbury and give language lessons to the children of bankers. She lay in the dark and did not think about what came after. She thought about Clause 7 and the review committee and the coal pricing mechanism and the things that still needed to be resolved in the morning session. She thought about these things very carefully for quite some time. Then she slept. She had been 7 years old the first time she heard her father say that listening was the most underestimated talent in the world. She had not understood what he meant, entirely, at 7. She had understood the word listening. Obviously she understood what listening was. She was a child, not a simpleton. But she had not understood why he said it with the particular weight he gave it, the same weight he gave to very few things. Her father was not an emphatic man. He did not use the word most lightly. Later she understood. She was lying awake on the last night of the summit, which she had told herself she would not do and which she was doing anyway, and she was thinking about that memory, because her mind, in the hours before sleep, had the habit of moving along its own tracks without asking her permission. It went to her father tonight, which was not unusual when she was doing work that she knew he would have wanted to see. It went to that particular memory, because something about the day, about all the days, but this one especially, was shaped by what he had meant when he said it. Listening was underestimated because people believed they were doing it when they were not. They were hearing. Hearing was what happened when sound reached your ears. Listening was something different. Listening was the act of attending to what the sound meant, not just in the direct sense of its words but in all the other senses, the pace of it, the gap before it, the register and the pitch and the particular choice of words when many other choices were available. Listening was the act of building, in real time, a picture of the person who was speaking that was more complete than the picture they were presenting. Eleanor had been doing this since before she had words for it. She had done it in Geneva with the French shopkeeper, and in Budapest with the civil servants' daughters, and in St. Petersburg at the dinner where she had been the telegraph wire, connecting everyone to everyone else. She had done it in the Bloomsbury house, translating texts that had originally been spoken by people she had never met, listening to the choices they had made in German or French, and understanding from those choices something about the person who had made them. She had done it in the conference room in Vienna for 5 days. It was the thing she was best at. She had known this for a long time, quietly and without drama, the way you know the things about yourself that are genuinely true, rather than the things you wish were true. She was not the cleverest person she knew. She was not the most educated. She was not the most experienced in any of the specific disciplines that the summit had required. Owen Marsh knew more about coal and railways. Edward knew more about the political dimensions of British commercial interests. Gideon Cross knew more about logistics and protocol. These were not areas where Eleanor was exceptional. But she could listen, in the full sense of the word, and she had found, over the week in Vienna, that this capacity, applied at the level the work required, was something that the people around her found genuinely remarkable. She had not let herself look at this too directly. There was a risk in it, not the risk of pride, which she was not particularly susceptible to, but the risk of wanting something that might not be available. She had learned, in the years after the Foreign Office rejections, to want only what she could actually have. This was a form of protection that had served her well. It kept her from spending energy on grief. But the protection had costs. She was lying awake at midnight on the last night of a summit where she had done the best work of her life, thinking about a man's expression when he had told her she was the best person in any room, and the protection was not entirely working. It was not that she was in love with Edward Ashworth. She was clear about this when she examined it carefully. She was not sure she had the framework for that kind of feeling readily available after years of having not had occasion to use it. What she felt was something adjacent but different, the recognition of being seen, fully and clearly, by someone who was capable of the clear seeing. This was rarer than love in Eleanor's experience. Love, or what passed for it in the social world she had grown up in, was frequently indifferent to the actual content of the person it was directed at. Being seen was something else. She had not been seen in years, perhaps not since her father died. She turned onto her side and looked at the window. The curtains were thin enough that she could see the faint glow of the gas lamps from the street. Vienna was genuinely quiet tonight, or as quiet as it ever got, the night sound muffled and distant. She thought about her mother's words before departure, the advice about how she would be treated, about the double standard of accuracy and success. Her mother had been right, and Eleanor had navigated all of it, the discomfort of the other delegation members, Vale's stiffness, Hoffman's initial condescension, Ernst the interpreter's careful professional assessment. She had navigated it all without apparent effort, which had required considerable actual effort, because the effort had to be invisible. Visible effort would have been read as struggle, and struggle would have been read as inadequacy, and inadequacy would have confirmed what everyone already thought they knew. But Edward had not treated her as a problem to be managed. He had not treated her as a condition to be tolerated. He had treated her as a resource, a valuable one he understood the value of and was not going to waste. And then, by the end, he had treated her as something more than a resource, though she was careful about how she named this even in her own mind. He had asked for her thinking, not just her skills, but her thinking. There was a difference, and he appeared to understand the difference, which was not something she had encountered frequently. She closed her eyes and tried to sleep. She slept eventually, at some time past 1 in the morning, and when she woke at 6 it was to the particular quality of light that meant the last day had arrived. She dressed. She reviewed her notes. She ate breakfast alone, quickly. She went to the conference room. The room felt different on the final morning. There was a specific atmosphere to the final session of a summit, a combination of urgency and relief, the sense of things coming together or not coming together, the awareness that the clock was real and that what was not resolved by the end of the day would not be resolved at all. People were more direct on final days. The formal pleasantries became thinner. The actual concerns came closer to the surface. Eleanor felt this and welcomed it. Direct rooms were easier to read than formal ones. The morning session opened with the remaining outstanding items from the coal pricing mechanism. There were 4 of them, of varying degrees of complexity. The simplest was the definition of the base currency for the pricing calculations, which had been left unresolved because 2 delegations had a nominal preference for different currencies that everyone knew was really a question of symbolic precedence rather than practical impact. Eleanor watched this being resolved through a compromise that was technically neutral and symbolically balanced, which was exactly what it needed to be. The second item was more complex, the dispute mechanism for pricing disagreements between signatories. This was where tempers became slightly visible. The French delegation wanted a mechanism that used an independent arbitrator. The Austrian delegation wanted a mechanism that defaulted to a joint committee of the signatories themselves. These were not compatible positions on the face of it, and the argument went back and forth for an hour in 3 languages simultaneously, which was the most demanding translation work Eleanor had done in the week. She held the thread through all of it. She kept the versions of the argument in 3 languages running parallel in her mind, caught the moments when something was said in one language that hadn't yet been said in another, made sure that Edward was hearing the full picture at every stage. She also, at one point, leaned over to Owen Marsh beside her and said quietly, "The Austrian proposal includes a rotation mechanism that they have not foregrounded. It's in the 2nd paragraph of their written submission. If you raise it now, it offers a bridge between their position and the French one." Owen found the page, read it in approximately 45 seconds and raised it. The room recalibrated. The argument found a path forward. The third item was the duration of the initial agreement. This was decided relatively quickly, because by now the delegations were tired, and the pragmatic desire for completion was stronger than the desire to negotiate this particular point. The fourth item was the hardest. It concerned the Eastern Railway concessions, specifically the routes through Galicia, which was a region of genuine strategic importance to both the Russian and Austrian delegations, and where the interests of those 2 parties were not easily reconciled. This had been set aside from the earlier railway discussions because everyone knew it was the most difficult, and the usual practice was to leave the most difficult thing for the end. The discussion opened with the Austrian framing and the Russian counterframing, which were so far apart that they seemed to describe different problems. Eleanor translated both with complete accuracy and noted, privately, that there was no easy path between them. The Hungarian delegation had a stake in the Galician routes and said so clearly. The French were attentive but not principal actors here. The Italians, the Ottomans, and the British were watching. Edward said almost nothing for the first hour. He listened. He took notes. He let the room develop its own shape, which Eleanor recognized as a deliberate choice. He was letting the principal parties establish the limits of their positions before bringing British weight to bear. She watched him do this and thought that her father had been right. Listening was the most underestimated talent, not just hers, his too, in a different register. At the 90-minute mark, when the Galician argument had reached the specific phase of difficulty where both sides were repeating themselves with slightly different emphasis but no new content, Edward spoke. He offered a proposal that was, in structure, a modification of a mechanism he and Eleanor had discussed the previous evening, where she had outlined the legal precedent from the Berlin Conference of 1885 that offered a model for exactly this kind of overlapping concession claim. He described it clearly, attributed it to established precedent rather than invention, and let the room assess it. The room assessed it. Volkov spoke. He said the mechanism was interesting and asked a specific question about the inspection rights. Eleanor translated this, and noted that he had asked a question rather than offered an objection, which was a signal of engagement rather than resistance. Hoffman spoke. He said the mechanism would require examination of the infrastructure survey data for the relevant section. Owen Marsh, without being asked, produced the relevant pages from his files. Hoffman's aide received them, read them, said something to Hoffman in a low voice. Hoffman's expression shifted almost imperceptibly toward interest. The next 2 hours were the most concentrated work Eleanor had done in her life. The mechanism was built in the room, piece by piece, across 6 languages, with each party contributing to and adjusting the structure, and Eleanor's work was to keep the structure identical in every language, to ensure that what the Austrian delegation believed they were agreeing to was the same as what the Russian delegation believed they were agreeing to, which was the same as what the British and French and Hungarian and Italian and Ottoman delegations believed they were agreeing to, with no gaps, no slippages, no ambiguities that could later be read differently. She caught 3 significant ambiguities and resolved them in real time, flagging them as technical clarifications that needed to be specified before the language was finalized. 2 of the 3 were genuinely accidental, things that arose from the difficulty of holding 6 languages in alignment on complex technical content. The third was less accidental, and she addressed it with the directness the moment required, proposing specific alternative language that removed the ambiguity, and the room accepted the alternative without difficulty, because by this point the room trusted her to be accurate. At 4:30 in the afternoon, Baron Hoffman declared the substantive business of the summit concluded. The delegations would reconvene at 6 for the formal signing of the agreement in principle, pending the drafting of the final text by the Secretariat, which would take the following 2 weeks. The conference room began to empty. People were speaking to each other across the table, shaking hands, exchanging the particular relief energy of a long, hard piece of work successfully completed. Owen Marsh was already talking to one of the Austrian technical delegates about the gauge specifications. Gideon Cross was reviewing his notes. Peter Vale was speaking to the French attaché, with the expression of a man who had undergone a week of events he had not entirely understood, and was processing them in retrospect. Eleanor sat at the table and wrote the last entry in her notebook for the day. She wrote it completely, and then she reviewed the summary of the week's records that she had compiled the previous evening, and she added the day's highlights to it. When she looked up, the room was nearly empty. Only Edward remained standing at the window, his thinking position, with his back to the room. She stood and closed her notebook and waited. He did not turn immediately. She had the impression of someone finishing a thought, arriving at the end of something long and demanding and recognizing its completion. He turned. His expression was the quiet version of something larger, not the professional composure or the calculated calm or the recalibration she had catalogued across the week, something more direct than any of those. It held, he said. The whole thing held. Yes, because of today's session. Because of all 5 days' sessions, she said. Today was the last piece. He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, and the saying of it seemed to come from somewhere past the professional register, somewhere closer to the real thing. I don't know how to thank you adequately. I am going to say something that does not do it justice, and you are going to tell me it was the work, and you were simply doing it. She looked back at him steadily. It was the work, she said, and I was simply doing it. She paused. But I am glad it was this work. He was quiet for a moment. Then, so am I. They stood in the empty conference room in Vienna at 4:30 on the 14th of October 1887, and the thing that existed between them in that moment was not love, not yet, and not simple professional regard, not anymore. It was something in the country between those 2 places that had no good English name and that Eleanor was, for the first time in a long time, not going to work hard to dismiss. She picked up her document case. She walked toward the door. She stopped. She said, without turning, "There is something in the agreement on the inspection rights for the Galician routes, a phrase in the Austrian original that the German translation has rendered slightly differently. I do not believe it will create a problem in practice, but it should be corrected in the final draft. I will write it up tonight and give it to Gideon in the morning." "All right," Edward said. She walked out into the corridor. Behind her, she heard him begin to gather his papers. She did not let herself feel the warmth of the room until she was back in her own, with the door closed behind her, and the linden tree in the courtyard, and the writing desk, and the last page of her notebook waiting to be filled. She sat down. She picked up her pen. She held it for a moment over the blank page. Then she wrote the day's final entry, and it was accurate, and it was complete, and in the margin beside the last paragraph she wrote, in the small, careful hand she used for personal observations rather than professional record, "Today was a good day." She closed the notebook. She looked at the courtyard. The linden tree was very still. She sat for a long time in the quiet, thinking of very little. It was, she decided, a good feeling. The formal signing ceremony at 6 o'clock that evening was a different kind of event from everything that had come before it. The sessions had been work. This was something else, something more staged, more consciously historical. The moment when the private business of a conference room was handed over to the public register of official record. The delegates changed into more formal dress. The hotel's largest reception room was opened, with its high gilded ceiling and its ranks of crystal chandeliers and its parquet floors that had been polished that afternoon to the kind of gleam that announced the arrival of significance. Eleanor wore the gray dress, as she had every day of the summit. She had not brought anything else. She stood with the British delegation slightly to the right of the main signing table, where the representatives of each party would affix their names to the agreement in principle. She was not at the table for this. She had been at the table all week. The signing table was for people with titles and official appointments, and Eleanor's title was Miss, and her official appointment did not exist, which were both accurate descriptions of her position and yet felt, tonight, like incomplete ones. She did not dwell on this. She was good at not dwelling. Baron Hoffmann spoke in German. His remarks were gracious and formal, and contained 3 sentences that were designed to be quoted in official history, which Eleanor translated quietly for Edward's benefit, and then for Owen Marsh's, who had appeared beside her and was listening carefully. Count Volkov spoke in Russian and said something that was, at its core, a recognition that productive outcomes required productive processes, which was the most that could be expected from a man of his careful habits, and which Eleanor found she appreciated for exactly that reason. Leblanc spoke in French. Rinaldi spoke in Italian. The Hungarian delegate spoke, surprisingly warmly, in Hungarian. The Ottoman representative offered a formal statement in Ottoman Turkish that was the most ornate contribution of the evening, and also, Eleanor noted, the most genuinely pleased. The British statement was given by Edward. He had written it himself. She knew this because she had seen a draft of it on his desk that afternoon when she dropped off a document, and the handwriting was his. He delivered it in English with the clean, measured precision she had come to associate with his best work, and she translated it into German and French as he spoke, passing it into the room in the 2 languages most likely to be understood by the full gathering. He did not mention her in the statement. This was appropriate. The ceremony was not the place for it, and she had not expected to be mentioned and would have found it uncomfortable if she had been. Public statements about the contribution of a woman at a diplomatic summit would have raised questions that the moment did not need. After the signing, the reception continued. Wine was poured. Conversations gathered in clusters and broke apart and reformed. The specific energy of people who have been through something difficult together and come out the other side ran through the room like a current. Various delegates spoke to Eleanor in the course of the evening. Ernst, the Austrian interpreter, found her and shook her hand with a formality that carried genuine respect. "Your work on Clause 7's committee language," he said in German, "was the clearest rendering I heard all week. I would like to know which school you attended." "I attended Europe," she said. He laughed. It was a genuine laugh, which she had not expected from him, and it made her revise her opinion of him somewhat upward. Kovacs found her later, near the window, where she had taken a moment of quiet from the gathering. He stood beside her and looked out at the courtyard rather than at her. He said in Hungarian, without preamble, that he was glad she had been in the dining room on the 4th evening. She said nothing, because there was nothing to say that would be more useful than silence. He said that the agreement they had signed tonight was a better agreement than the one that had been privately arranged, and that this was not an accident. He said that he did not know precisely how it had been corrected, though he had his thoughts on the subject, and that he was not going to ask. She said, in Hungarian, that she appreciated his discretion. He looked at her then, briefly. His expression was the careful, contained one she had studied all week, and behind it was something that was not quite admiration but was close to it. He said that he hoped the British government was paying her appropriately. She said, evenly, that she had agreed terms in advance. He made a sound that was not quite an answer and returned to the gathering. She watched him go. The evening wound down slowly, as these things did, and the delegations made their way back to their various rooms and private dinners in the quiet aftermath of a completed thing. The British party gathered briefly in the delegation sitting room, not for any formal purpose but in the way that people gather after a shared experience when they are not quite ready to be separately alone with it. Owen Marsh described the Eastern Railway mechanism to himself in a satisfied undertone, reviewing it apparently for the pleasure of reviewing it. Charles Holt was already writing notes. Peter Vale sat in the corner of the room and said very little, which had become his pattern by the end of the week. He had arrived with certainties, and the certainties had not survived the week intact, and he was doing the slow work of updating them, which Eleanor gave him credit for even though she had no particular warmth for him. Gideon Cross distributed a brief end-of-mission summary he had prepared, which was efficient and thorough and characteristically understated about everything that had actually happened. Eleanor read it and added, in her own neat handwriting in the margin of her copy, the note about the Austrian phrase in the Galician inspection rights clause, and handed it to Gideon, who read it, nodded, and put it in the working file. Then she excused herself and went to bed, because she was tired in all the ways it was possible to be tired, and because tomorrow they would pack and leave, and the day after that she would be back in Bloomsbury, and there was a student of hers, a 10-year-old boy who was learning German because his father did business in Hamburg, who had a lesson scheduled for the Friday that she should not be too tired to teach. The journey home was different from the journey out. On the train back through Austria and France, the atmosphere of the delegation was different, looser, less prepared, the careful readiness of people doing important work, replaced by the quieter state of people who have done it and are returning. Owen Marsh slept for much of France. Gideon Cross reviewed his notes with systematic efficiency. Peter Vale read a novel. Charles Holt wrote more letters. Eleanor worked. She wrote up the full summit record, not the brief daily entries she had made each evening, but a comprehensive account of the week's proceedings as she had experienced them, which was a different account from the official record, and which she was writing for herself and for no one else. She wrote it in her careful, dense hand, in English, and she was thorough, and she did not leave out anything that she thought was genuinely important. She wrote about the discrepancy she had found in the preliminary briefing materials. She wrote about the Baron Hoffmann pleasantry traps and the way they had been deflected. She wrote about Ernst's translation and the correction in the first session. She wrote about Kovacs and his English and his checking. She wrote about Clause 7 and Count Volkov and the dinner conversation and the note and the 8 o'clock meeting in the reading room. She wrote about the Galician routes and the 4 outstanding items and the mechanism for the inspection rights. She wrote all of it because she had learned, a long time ago, that work that is not recorded becomes harder to learn from, and she intended to learn from this week for a very long time. On the crossing from Calais, the sea was rough again, as it had been on the way out. Eleanor stood on the deck for a few minutes, which she preferred to the enclosed cabin when the motion was significant, and felt the cold wind and the spray and the sea's particular reminder that the world was much larger than any room, even a room as consequential as the one she had just been sitting in. Edward came and stood beside her on the deck. He had done this on the crossing out as well, she remembered, had appeared on deck for the same reason probably, the preference for cold air over enclosed motion. They stood without speaking for a moment. The sea moved under the ship. "The Foreign Office dispatch," he said. "I will write it on Monday. The formal account of the summit outcomes. I intend to include your name in it." She turned to look at him. The wind was very strong, and the sea light made everything look clean and sharp-edged. "That is not necessary." "It is accurate," he said. "You made material contributions to the outcome of these negotiations. The dispatch will reflect that." He paused. "I cannot guarantee what the Foreign Office will do with a dispatch that includes your name in a professional capacity. They may choose to file it without acting on it, but the record will exist." She looked at him. She had a sudden clear memory of being 17 in St. Petersburg, sitting in a garden in the late summer with a book she was supposed to be studying, and thinking about what her life would be, the way 17-year-olds think about the future, as a territory full of things that were going to happen. She had thought about languages and diplomacy, and the world she had been growing up inside, and what it would mean to contribute to it in a real way. She had not thought about a gray dress and a narrow house in Bloomsbury, and the Foreign Office turning away 2 job applications. She had not known to think about those things. She had been 17 and full of the honest, clear expectation that the world would eventually make room for what she was. "I would appreciate the record," she said, "whether or not anyone acts on it." He nodded. He looked out at the sea for a moment. "When we return, the work you were doing before, the lessons, the translations, is that enough for you?" She thought about how to answer this, because it was a question that deserved a true answer, and the true answer was not simple. "It has been sufficient," she said. "It has not always been enough. There are other diplomatic postings, not just summits, ongoing translation work, correspondence, preliminary negotiations. I have used interpreters for various purposes, across several years of work in this area. The requirement does not end." She looked at him. "I am suggesting," he said carefully, "that there may be more work of this kind if you want it. I cannot promise the Foreign Office will move, but the private arrangement, under the delegation's umbrella, that is something I can continue to request." She was quiet for a moment. The sea was very loud around them. "That would depend," she said, "on whether the work is genuine. I am not interested in an arrangement that is charity or accommodation. If the work requires what I can do, I will do it. If it is being created to provide me with income or purpose, I would rather continue giving German lessons in Bloomsbury." "The work is genuine," he said. "It has always been genuine. The lack of it was a bureaucratic failure, not a judgment about its necessity." She turned back to the sea. She felt the wind and the cold and the enormous wide sky of the Channel crossing, and she felt, underneath all of it, the things she had felt before departure and had been careful about examining too closely. It was more robust now than it had been a week ago. It had been tested and had held. "Then yes," she said, "I would like the work." They stood in companionable silence for a while longer. The ship moved through the gray water. England was somewhere ahead of them in the mist, coming closer. She thought about her mother, who would be in the Bloomsbury parlor, and who would ask 2 or 3 precise questions, and then make tea. She thought about the boy who was learning German, because his father did business in Hamburg, and how she would continue his lessons on Friday. She thought about the record she had written on the train, which was thorough and complete, and which she would keep, because she kept everything that mattered. She thought about a gray dress with a good collar, which she had worn every day of the summit, and which she would wear again when the next occasion required it. She did not think too carefully about standing on a ship's deck in a cold wind next to the Duke of Harrowfield, because some things were better thought about carefully later, and this was one of them. But she noted it. She noted it the way she noted everything, with the careful, honest attention of someone who intended to understand what was real. The English coast appeared in the mist, distant and familiar and entirely itself. She watched it come. She was coming home, she thought. And for the first time in a long time, she was coming home with something more than she had left with. The ship moved steadily through the water. The coast came closer. She was ready. 3 weeks after the delegation returned from Vienna, Eleanor received a document in the mail. It was delivered with the Morning Post on a Thursday, in a plain envelope with the Foreign Office seal, which was unusual enough that her mother brought it upstairs to her personally, rather than leaving it on the hall table as she usually did with correspondence. Catherine set it on Eleanor's desk without comment, looked at her daughter's face for exactly long enough to assess what was needed, and then left without saying anything, which was one of the reasons Eleanor admired her mother as much as she did. Eleanor opened the envelope. It was a copy of the formal diplomatic dispatch from the Vienna summit, dated the 17th of October, 1887, signed by Edward Ashworth and countersigned by the Foreign Secretary's office. It was 3 pages. The language was formal and precise, in the style of such documents, which tended toward the long sentence and the passive voice, and the careful attribution of credit to institutions rather than individuals. She read it. In the second paragraph of the final page, in the same style as the rest of the document, plain and formal and without any emphasis, the dispatch recorded that the outcome of the summit negotiations had been materially assisted by the work of Miss Eleanor Voss, who had served as the delegation's primary interpreter, and whose knowledge of the languages and diplomatic contexts of all 7 participating parties had been essential to the achievement of the Vienna Accord. She read it twice. The second time, she read the word essential more slowly than the other words. It was a word she had not expected. Useful would have been appropriate. Significant would have been generous. Essential was what you said when you were being as accurate as possible, and accuracy required a strong word. She set the document down. She looked out at the courtyard. The linden tree had lost all its remaining leaves now, in the weeks since she had returned, and it stood stripped and winter-pale against the November sky. She was quiet for a while. Then she picked up the document and went downstairs to show her mother. Catherine read it standing in the kitchen with her reading glasses on, which she used for small print and for documents she wanted to take seriously. She read it completely. Then she set it on the kitchen table and said, "Good." "Good," Eleanor agreed. Catherine made tea. They sat in the kitchen in companionable silence, which was one of their preferred modes of being together, and drank their tea, and outside the small garden was quiet and bare, and the November morning was everything November mornings usually were, ordinary and domestic and completely indifferent to whatever was happening in the people who moved through it. Eleanor had always liked this about domesticity, its honest indifference to the drama of the world beyond. In the weeks that followed, several things happened. Some of them were significant, and some of them were small, and some of them fell somewhere between those two categories. Edward wrote to her twice, once about a routine translation matter regarding some preliminary correspondence for a possible future meeting with the French commercial ministry, and once about something personal that was not quite personal because he expressed it in a register that was careful and professional, offering an invitation to attend a diplomatic luncheon at which he said her presence would be professionally valuable, which she believed was both true and also not the complete reason for the invitation. She attended the luncheon. The work was genuine. The other reason, if she was correct about it, remained unaddressed in the formal sense, because both of them were people who moved carefully in the places where something real was at stake. She found this, on consideration, entirely sensible. She was not in a hurry. She had waited for the Foreign Office to come to its senses for 8 years. She had patience for the things that were worth patience. The translation work that Edward had suggested did come, not a flood of it, but a steady trickle, each assignment genuine and carefully considered. A correspondence review for a preliminary trade discussion in March, some document preparation for a bilateral meeting with the French in April, a 3-day posting in May when a minor commercial negotiation needed someone who could work between English and German and Russian without losing the thread. She did all of it well. She was paid for all of it properly. Gideon Cross was the one who managed the administrative arrangements, which made them efficient and unambiguous, which was how Gideon managed everything. He was also, she noticed, the one who handled any questions from the Foreign Office Resources Department about the nature of her engagement, and he handled them in the same quiet, efficient way he handled everything, providing the information required and no additional explanation. She continued to give language lessons to the children of wealthy families. She continued to translate texts for publishers. She did these things because they were her livelihood, and they used her skills, and she was good at them, and she had no philosophical objection to them. The new work did not replace the old work. It added to it. The Foreign Office remained formally silent on the subject of Eleanor Voss for most of the year that followed Vienna. The dispatch had been received, filed, and not mentioned. This changed in late summer of 1888, in a meeting that Eleanor was not present at, and which she learned about later from Gideon, who learned about it from a colleague, and which had apparently involved the deputy director of the Translation Bureau, who had been informed, by a senior official whose name Gideon did not share but whose identity Eleanor found she could guess with some confidence, that the Bureau's staffing policy had certain gaps that had created a significant difficulty at the Vienna summit, and that it was the senior official's strongly held view that these gaps should be addressed. The deputy director had apparently asked some clarifying questions and received clear answers. The letter arrived in September. It was formal and official and very much in the style of an institution that has decided to do something it has not done before and is doing it with the particular stiffness of something unprecedented. It offered Eleanor Voss a contract as an interpreter to the Foreign Office at a specified professional level, with a specified fee structure, for a term of 2 years renewable. It did not apologize for the previous 2 rejections. It did not explain them. It simply offered the position. She read the letter in her study, at her desk, with the window open because September was warm enough for it and she liked the air when it was warm. Outside, the garden had recovered from the winter and the linden tree. There was a linden tree in the Bloomsbury garden too, not just in Vienna, was green and full. She thought about sitting in the conference room in Vienna at 10 o'clock on the 5th day of the summit, writing the last entry in her notebook for the day, and writing in the margin, "Today was a good day." She thought about her father, who had told her that listening was the most underestimated talent in the world, who had died not knowing whether the things he had taught her would ever be permitted to be useful in the way they deserved to be useful, who had believed in her, quietly and consistently, in the way that certain people believe in certain other people, not loudly, not with great declaration, but with the steady certainty of someone who has looked at something clearly and seen what is there. She thought about her mother in the kitchen, reading the dispatch with her glasses on and saying good. She picked up her pen. She wrote her acceptance of the position in her usual clear, deliberate hand. She said yes to the offer, confirmed the term, and signed her name. She sent it with the afternoon post. Then she went downstairs and told her mother. In the years that followed, Eleanor Voss worked for the Foreign Office in the capacity the contract described, and then beyond it as the contract was renewed and extended, and eventually formalized into something more permanent. She worked at 3 more international conferences. She worked on bilateral correspondence for 7 different diplomatic engagements. She worked on document preparation, position papers, and the translation of materials that were significant enough that getting them wrong would have had real consequences. She was always accurate. She was always thorough. She always found the thing that other people had not noticed. She remained in the Bloomsbury house with her mother until Catherine died, peacefully, in 1901, in the same bedroom she had occupied since returning from Europe 20 years earlier. Eleanor continued in the house after that because she liked it and because the linden tree in the garden was 30 years old by then and she was accustomed to it. She did not become the Duchess of Harrowfield. This is not what this story is, and it is not what Eleanor wanted, and it is not what either of them pursued. Which is not to say that nothing grew between them, but rather that what grew between them grew in its own shape, and not the shape that convention expected. They were colleagues. They were more than colleagues. They were, by some definitions, friends, which was a word that covered a great deal of territory between the ordinary and the extraordinary, and in their case covered most of it. Edward died in 1906, which was 19 years after Vienna. He died as he had lived, with the composed, contained attention of a man who did not waste his energy on what he could not change. He left, among other things, a letter that his solicitor delivered to Eleanor in the spring of 1907, which she read once in her study with the window open, and then put in the locked drawer of her desk where she kept the things that were entirely her own. His memorial was held at the chapel attached to the Foreign Office, which was the appropriate location for a man who had spent most of his adult life doing its work. The chapel was full. There were people there from 6 countries, which said something about the breadth of the work he had done and the number of rooms in which he had done it. Eleanor arrived before the service and took a seat near the back, as she had always preferred. She liked to see the whole room, and she sat through the service with the composed attention she brought to everything. Gideon Cross sat beside her. He was retired by then, gray and slightly diminished in the way of men in their 60s who have been very active and find the reduction of activity somewhat puzzling. He said nothing, which was right. He had always understood when nothing was the correct amount to say. After the service, the Foreign Office's current deputy director of the Translation Bureau found her in the courtyard and said that her work over the 20 years since Vienna had been foundational to several significant outcomes, which was the most that a Foreign Office official would say in that context, and which she received with a nod and a brief word of thanks. She walked home from the chapel. It was a spring morning, clear and fresh, and London was doing what it always did, being enormous and noisy, and entirely self-absorbed and magnificent. She walked through it without hurrying, the way she had been walking through it for 50 years, taking in the sounds and the movement and the particular quality of London light on a clear day. She thought about the gray October morning in 1887, when she had walked from Mayfair back to Bloomsbury after her first meeting with Edward Ashworth, going home to pack a trunk for Vienna. She had been 34 years old. She had been tired in a specific way, the tiredness of someone who has been patient for a long time, and is not entirely certain that patience is going to be rewarded. She was in her 50s now, and the tiredness she felt today was different. Not the tiredness of waiting, the tiredness of someone who has worked hard for a long time and has, on balance, done what she came to do. It was a better kind of tired. She reached Bloomsbury and turned into her street and walked past the familiar gardens and the familiar houses and stopped at the gate of her own home. The linden tree was fully leafed out in the spring warmth, its branches moving very slightly in the breeze. She stood and looked at it for a moment. She had translated 10,000 words in the days after her father's death, sitting at this same desk, in this same house, working because that was what she did when the world was difficult, and the work was what remained. She had kept going, she had kept working, she had waited for the world to understand what it had in her, and she had not wasted the time while she waited, and when the moment came she had been ready for it. She opened the gate. She walked up the path. She let herself in. Inside the house was quiet. The study was where it always was, at the back, with the window overlooking the garden, and the desk with its orderly stacks of work, and the drawer that contained the things that were entirely her own. She went in. She sat down. She opened the notebook she was currently working in and found the current page. She was working on a translation from Russian, a historical document from the 1860s relating to railway negotiations in Central Asia, for a publisher who wanted an English edition. It was interesting work. The Russian of the 1860s had a specific texture, a particular way of describing industrial and geographic concepts that she found genuinely engaging to render into English without losing the flavor of the period. She picked up her pen. She worked until evening. The light changed in the garden as the hours passed, going from the clear spring brightness of afternoon to the gentler gold of early evening, and the linden tree moved in the light with the easy, unhurried motion of something that has been growing in the same place for a long time and has made its peace with exactly where it is. Eleanor wrote until the light was too low for comfort, then set down her pen, closed the notebook, and sat for a moment in the quiet room. She had done what she came to do. She thought of her father. She thought of Vienna. She thought of the gray dress with the good collar, which was still in her wardrobe and still fitted, because some things were made well and lasted. She thought about the word essential, which she had read in a Foreign Office dispatch on a Thursday morning a long time ago, and which had been true. The evening came on slowly. The garden was peaceful. The linden tree was still. She sat in her study and the day settled quietly around her, and she was, in the plain and uncomplicated sense of the word, content. It was enough. It had, in the end, been more than enough. The ink on the Vienna Accord had dried long ago. The railways had been built, the coal had moved along them. The agreements had held, by and large, through the years that followed, and when they had frayed, it had been because of the world's own complications, and not because of any failure in the work that had made them. The work had been good. She had made it good. This was the thing she knew most clearly. In the quiet room in Bloomsbury on a spring evening 50 years into a life that had not gone the way she had imagined at 17, but had gone, in many ways, better than she had a right to expect, and in some ways exactly as she had always known it should. She stood. She went to the window. The garden was nearly dark now, the linden tree a gentle shape in the last light. She looked at it for a moment, then she drew the curtain and turned on the lamp, and went to make her dinner, because the day was done, and tomorrow there was more work, and she was glad of it.